Chapter 129. However, if he really wanted to kill her, it was not impossible. Although the little girl was smart and quick-witted, her martial arts were only average and she did not have any backing. If he really wanted to kill her, he had plenty of ways. However, he did not know why he could not bear to do so. Perhaps he was also moved by the thought of taking pity on her? After all, this little girl had superb medical skills. If he could subdue her and use her, it would not be a loss of a good arm. The mountains were extremely high and pierced through the clouds. There were many mountain ranges and it was a magnificent sight. This mountain had a total of 17 peaks. The outermost peak was the shortest and also the longest. Then, each peak was taller than the previous one. However, the length of the mountain also began to shorten. The tallest peak was the 9th peak. After the 9th peak, the peaks became shorter and shorter. If one looked down from the sky, the entire mountain looked like an open book. It also looked like some kind of array. The mountains were bent and surrounded the 9th peak as if they were worshipping it. Clouds and mist lingered in the middle. The name Heavenly Book Mountain was very appropriate. Heavenly Book Mountain was a sacred mountain. There were many ferocious demonic beasts in the mountain. This was something that every citizen of the Tianci continent knew. Ordinary people did not dare to enter this place. Even warriors with good martial arts did not dare to enter the mountain. At most, they would move around the periphery and gather some rare medicinal herbs. If they could hunt a demonic beast that did not have high attack power, they would be treated as heroes. Of course, this was also an excellent place to cultivate. The disciples of the various sects in the vast Sky Empire often came here to kill monsters and cultivate. However, they only dared to move around the 3rd peak and below. Only cultivators who had reached the peak of the human stage dared to go deeper. However, they could only go up to the 6th peak and did not dare to go deeper. This was because it was said that the 7th, 8th, and 9th peaks were the gathering place of large demonic beasts. It was said that the demonic beasts there were ferocious and tyrannical. Moreover, they could use psychokinesis to attack. Their attack power was extremely strong. Even cultivators who had just reached the 1st stage of the Earth stage did not dare to face them directly. It was said that the current crown prince had once reached the middle of the 8th peak and hunted a demonic lion. He obtained the crystal from the demonic lion and became famous. The wood crystal that Ning Xuema used to test her psychokinesis in the palace was this crystal. As for the 9th peak, it was said that the demonic beasts there were not only ferocious but also cunning and fickle. They could change into various shapes and it was impossible to guard against them. In the entire Tianci continent, only the patriarchs of the 5 great sects had been in there. The others could forget about it, they would only be courting death if they went in. Ning Xuema was a psychic trash. With her talent, it would be dangerous even if she entered the 1st mountain. Therefore, number 2 thought that Ning Xuema was just hiding from the pursuers at the periphery of the 1st mountain peak and would not go deep into the mountain recklessly. What the guard didn't expect was that not only did Ning Xuema quickly cross the 1st mountain, she also quickly crossed the 2nd mountain. He had only followed her for 6 hours, but she had already started to cross the 3rd mountain. The mountains were densely forested, and the Heavenly Book Mountain in particular was practically a primeval forest. There were naturally many ferocious beasts in the primeval forest. This bodyguard had followed Ning Xuema from afar, so he had naturally encountered them several times. What made number 2's jaw drop was that Ning Xuema's movements were not just a little strange. She would avoid the ferocious beasts if she could, but if she met them on a narrow path, she would run. In the eyes of this bodyguard, Ning Xuema's movements were not the fastest, but she was the most agile and the most tricky. No matter how aggressive the ferocious beast was, she would always be able to avoid it in the nick of time without a single injury. Chapter 130. No matter how aggressive the ferocious beast was, she would always be able to dodge it in the nick of time without suffering any injuries. She would take a step to the east and a step to the west. It didn't seem like she was using any method, but the beasts would always miss her. Moreover, she would never continue fighting. Once she dodged a beast's attack, she would immediately run away. Her running route was also strange. She would suddenly run to the left and right, up and down, making the beasts chasing after her confused and disoriented. In the end, they gave up. Of course, there were also beasts that were more persistent. They would chase after her without letting go. If she could shake them off, she would do so. If she couldn't, she would suddenly turn around to face the enemy. The beasts that chased after her didn't have a good ending. They would be hit by the flying needles in her hand. The needles were obviously poisonous. Once the beasts were hit by the needles, they would immediately fall to the ground and die. She would often pat the beasts' heads and sigh, "Poor child, don't you know that some people can't be eaten? You're so persistent. Aren't you courting death? Originally, I took pity on you because you're a second-class protected animal and wanted to be merciful to you. It's you who didn't know what's good for you." After she finished lamenting, she would pluck a bunch of flowers or grass from the side and stick them in the ears of the beasts as a final sacrifice. Then she would get up and continue on her way. However, number 2, who was following behind her, was greatly shocked. What kind of monster was this little girl reincarnated from? He was originally very disdainful of Ning Xuema. Who would really look up to a good-for-nothing? When Ji Yunhao sent him to protect her, he was originally somewhat impatient and had some complaints. But now he was suddenly glad that he had followed her. There were too many strange things about this little girl. He couldn't help but want to explore more. Following behind her wasn't boring at all. This imperial bodyguard was already at the 8th level of the human realm. Naturally, he didn't feel any pressure when traversing the 3 mountains. He was also confident that he could protect this little girl when she was in danger. But if this little girl was avoiding the pursuers, hiding on the 2nd mountain would be enough. Why did she run to the 3rd mountain without looking back? Did she not know the danger, or did she have a plan? Another 4 hours passed. Number 2 felt that his whole body was going to be unwell. This girl actually managed to pass through the 3rd and 4th mountain peaks without any mishap, and was now heading towards the 5th mountain peak. With number 2's cultivation, he could still barely deal with the beasts on the 4th mountain, but even he wouldn't dare to charge into the 5th mountain. Did this little girl eat the guts of a leopard? Where did she want to go? The mountain forest became denser and denser. The tall trees covered the sky and the sun, preventing the sunlight from penetrating. Under the trees there were all kinds of shrubs covering all the paths. The branches were intertwined with each other. Poisonous and non-poisonous shrubs entwined together. If it was an ordinary person, they would not be able to walk in it. However, Ning Xuema was not an ordinary person. She was a special agent who had undergone countless field training. She did not have many things on her, but she could always use the grass and trees around her to make it as easy as walking on flat ground in this primitive forest. For example, when the path in front of her was covered with needle-like thorns, she would take out a long vine that had appeared in her hand at some unknown time. With a shake of her hand, she would throw it towards a big tree in front of her. Then she would swing the vine forward like a swing and land on the tree. She would then throw the vine towards a big tree in the distance and swing over again. She was even more agile than a monkey, swinging from tree to tree. Number 2 couldn't help but secretly give her a thumbs up. Chapter 131. Not to mention other things, just based on her qinggong, she was much stronger than that lady who had 3rd-level psychokinesis. What was even rarer was her reaction speed and adaptability. Even if it was him, he would have to concede defeat. It was such a pity that such a girl had to bear the title of trash. But with her martial arts, she could deal with the beasts from the first 3 peaks who only knew physical attacks. But could she deal with the magical beasts from the 5th peak? Their attacks were not only physical attacks, they also had psychokinesis from a distance. The larger and more ferocious the beast, the lesser the number of beasts. This was the case for the beasts on the 5th peak. You couldn't see them easily, but once you encountered them, it would usually be fatal. Like now, Ning Xuema was holding onto a vine and was flying on the tree. Just as she was about to land on a tree trunk, just as her toes touched the tree trunk, a green shadow suddenly sprang up from the tree trunk and opened its black mouth to bite Ning Xuema's legs. Jasper Centipede. Number 2's fingers instantly clenched tightly. Ning Xuema had seen all kinds of centipedes, but she had never seen such a huge one. Its body was as thick as a bowl and 10 feet long. Its entire body was dark green and its head was like a flat dustpan. There were countless claws on both sides of its body which were like rows of sharp blades, shining with a cold light. There were 2 long feelers at the side of its mouth which swayed in the wind like a snake, and its 2 front teeth were as sharp as knives. Ning Xuema had no doubt that once her body was bitten by this thing, she would definitely be cut in half. This thing was extremely good at camouflage. She didn't know where it was lying in ambush earlier, and it actually took advantage of Ning Xuema's lack of support to launch a surprise attack. Ning Xuema's reaction was extremely fast. The moment she realized that something was wrong, she suddenly flipped her body upwards and her feet brushed against the centipede's feelers as she flew over. Her dodge was extremely thrilling and the tip of her feet almost kicked the centipede's 2 front teeth. She took the opportunity to land on the branch of the tree behind the jasper centipede. She hadn't even steadied herself when the jasper centipede suddenly let out a sharp shriek. Its large tail swept towards Ning Xuema. Damn! This thing's attack speed was actually so fast. Ning Xuema flew up again and narrowly avoided the centipede's tail. A cold light flashed in her palm and she pierced the centipede's body. Her needle was dipped in a strong poison and even an elephant would be poisoned in an instant. Although this thing was bigger than an ordinary centipede, it was still much smaller than an elephant. As long as the needle was pierced, the centipede's numerous claws would kick. Ding! The sound of metal colliding rang out as Ning Xuema's needle pierced the centipede's body. But it was bounced back. The jade-green scales on this fellow's body were actually harder than steel. Her stab, which was infused with her inner strength, was completely unable to pierce through it. Chew! Although the jasper centipede's body wasn't pierced, it was still shaken by Ning Xuema's inner force. All of a sudden it was enraged. Its body suddenly curled up before shooting outwards. Unexpectedly, it was like an oversized cannonball, smashing towards Ning Xuema. The evil wind blew against her face. Ning Xuema didn't dare to face it head-on. In a moment of crisis, she used an iron plank bridge. First, she leaned against the tree trunk, then her body fell straight down. Using her legs to hook onto the tree trunk, she finally avoided this guy's cannonball attack. Bang! The jasper centipede's huge body crashed into the tree. With a loud crack, the tree that was as thick as a person's arm fell down. Ning Xuema's body fell straight down from the tree that was more than 10 feet tall. Chapter 132. Shit! I forgot that this guy is heavy. The green vine in Ning Xuema's hand flew out, finally wrapping itself around a nearby tree. With a tug, her body flew out diagonally. Just as she was about to land on the tree again, a burst of scorching hot air suddenly rushed towards her from behind. She hurriedly lowered her body and a fireball flew over her head. Although it did not hit her head, it hit her vine. The vine snapped, and at a speed visible to the naked eye, rapidly corroded the end of the vine that Ning Xuema was holding. Ning Xuema had no choice but to throw the vine away. At this moment her body was still in the air. Without anything in her hand, she could only fall down. The green jade centipede also leapt, pouncing towards the falling Ning Xuema. A pair of soybean-sized red eyes flashed with an ominous glint. Little brat! A little brat dares to fight with me. I'll roast you into jerky. Another fireball shot towards Ning Xuema. Number 2 sensed something was wrong and was about to act, but unexpectedly Ning Xuema, who had nothing to rely on, twisted her body in the air and evaded the fireball. At the same time, with a flick of her sleeve, a sparkling long rope flew out. Like a bolt of lightning, it shot up and wrapped around the thick waist of the green jade centipede. With a tug, her body actually flew up again, and the jasper centipede's speed of descent became even faster. Thereupon, puff! The sound of branches breaking rang out one after another. The green jade centipede's huge body smashed into the thorny brambles, knocking down a large area. On the other hand, Ning Xuema's body lightly landed on a tree several zhang away, completely unscathed. Wonderful! It's really wonderful. It's even more wonderful than watching two masters fight. Number 2, who was hiding in the shadows, was entranced by the scene. This little girl is too cool. If he did not remember the 6th prince's instructions, he would have cheered out loud. Whoosh! A gust of wind rose from the ground, and the green jade centipede flew straight up from the brambles. It was probably the first time it was in such a sorry state. The scales all over its body stood up. With a long howl, a pair of wings grew out from its ribs. With a flap of its wings, it pounced straight towards Ning Xuema. Flying centipede. The centipede actually grew wings. Does it have to be so abnormal? The jasper centipede was clearly enraged. It continuously spat out fireballs from its mouth and flew towards Ning Xuema. Number two's expression changed drastically when he saw the jasper centipede grow a pair of wings. What Ning Shuama had provoked was a flying dragon centipede. But the flying centipede was a flying centipede. However, the flying dragon centipede was the king of centipedes. Its psychokinesis had already reached the 6th rank. It should be a monster that only existed on the 6th peak. He did not expect to encounter one on the 5th peak. Even he might not be a match for it. I'm afraid this is bad. Before he could finish his thought, Ning Shuama shot towards him like lightning. And number two, don't just watch, give me a hand. Number two was stunned. Number two? Who is she calling? Does she have other helpers here? She shouldn't have, right? If there were other masters nearby, he should be able to detect them with his skills. No. Her eyes were clearly looking at him. She was calling him. Number two's handsome face darkened. But Ning Shuama had already brushed past him. She even brushed aside the leaves that he was hiding behind. Chapter 133. As a result, number two's figure was completely exposed to the flying dragon centipede that was pouncing towards him. Damn it! A black light flashed in number two's palm, and a black iron sword appeared in his hand. With a wave of the sword, ripples of light appeared, and the fireballs that were chasing after Ning Shuama directly collided with the ripples of light. Number two was originally standing on the thick trunk of a large tree, and the huge impact caused his body to sway. However, the trunk under his feet could not withstand the impact, and with a cracking sound the branches broke and he fell down. Fortunately, his qigong was not bad, and with a turn of his body in the air, he jumped onto another large tree. That flying dragon centipede was blocked by him, and was instantly enraged. It immediately changed its target, and vented all its anger on him. In the blink of an eye, one person and one insect were fighting. This fierce battle caused the nearby trees to suffer, and broken branches and leaves flew everywhere. Fireballs and blue waves danced together. Mixed with the deafening roar of the centipede and the sound of trees breaking, it was exceptionally hair-raising. Number two was also distracted by the fierce battle to find Ning Shuama's whereabouts. That little girl had lured a disaster to him, and by now, she had already disappeared without a trace. That girl who burned the bridge after crossing it. This flying dragon centipede was extremely fast and it was petty. If he slightly offended it, it would definitely not let him go, and would not rest until he was dead. Ning Shuama could take the opportunity to escape, but number two could not. He could only grit his teeth and fight with it. After fighting for about half an hour, number two's forehead was covered with sweat, and his arms were sore and limp. This flying dragon centipede was really too strong, and its strength was great, its movements were fast, and its fireballs were fierce. Every direct hit caused number two's arms to go numb, and the bones in his body felt like they were about to be shattered. The blood in his chest was surging, and there were several times where he wanted to vomit blood. On the other hand, that flying dragon centipede did not suffer many injuries. There were only a few places where it was stabbed by his sword, leaving shallow traces of blood. To its huge body, these injuries were obviously just superficial wounds and were not fatal at all. It did not even slow down its movements at all. Am I going to die here? This place was deserted, so he didn't have to hope for reinforcements at all. Moreover, he was obviously not a match for this monster. If this stalemate continued, then he would be unable to escape death sooner or later. Number two felt despair in his heart. However, as a bodyguard who often rolled on the battlefield of life and death, he had a belief that even if he knew it was a dead end, he would fight until the very last moment. He gritted his teeth and fought hard. Even if he died, he wanted to leave a few more bloody wounds on this guy's body. Just as he was getting dizzy from all the killing, a clear voice suddenly rang out not far away from him. Lure it over here. Ning Shuama. She didn't take the opportunity to run for her life? He actually came back. Number two's heart, which had always been calm, warmed slightly. He was a bodyguard. Since young, he had been taught to serve his master until his death. It was their instinct to protect their master and retreat in the face of danger. Moreover, they had never felt that it was wrong for their master to abandon them and flee alone. Although Ning Shuama was not his master, she was someone he had been ordered to protect, and she was also the daughter of a marquis. He felt that it was normal for her to run for her life, but her reappearance was out of his expectations. However, with her three-legged cat's martial arts, even if she came back, she would only be sending herself to her death. She would not be able to change the outcome. Chapter 134. Hurry up and leave. Otherwise, you won't be able to leave. Number 2 shouted anxiously. Stop talking nonsense. Lure it over. Ning Shuama's voice rang out again. This time, her voice was much more stern and firm. Number 2 was slightly stunned. He had seen many girls who liked to throw their weight around, but it was his first time encountering someone like Ning Shuama. His heart trembled and he subconsciously wanted to obey. But if he lured the monster to her, wouldn't both of them die? Ah! A sharp sound rang out as a broken limb shot towards the flying dragon centipede's back. While number 2 was in a daze, Ning Shuama made her move. Although she didn't hurt the centipede at all, she successfully angered it. It turned its head and saw Ning Shuama standing on a branch not far away. The branch was very thin. She stood on top of it and waved at her with a smile. Come on, many-legged monster. When enemies meet, their eyes turn red. The flying dragon centipede roared and rushed over. This reckless girl. Number 2 also rushed over. Aya! The branch under Ning Shuama's feet was burned by the flying dragon centipede's fireball. She screamed and fell down. Number 2's heart sank. The place where Ning Shuama fell was a thorny forest that was taller than a person. If she fell in, even if she didn't die, she would be pierced by the thorns as thick as steel needles and become a hedgehog. The flying dragon centipede probably hated her so much that it didn't let her go even after forcing her down the branch. It wanted to burn her again or slap her with its claws. It shook its head and wagged its tail as it rushed down. It was obvious that it wanted to finish her off. Just as Ning Shuama's body was about to fall into the thorny forest, she threw out a soft rope with lightning speed and wrapped it around the flying dragon centipede's body. It was the same move as before. Ning Shuama used the momentum to fly up and kick the flying dragon centipede. And so, bang! The flying dragon centipede fell into the thicket once more. Ning Shuama lightly stood on top of a tree branch not far away. She beamed as she pointed her pinky at the brambles. You fell in the same place twice. An insect will always be an insect. You only have a body but not a brain. Number 2, who had rushed over, was speechless. Not only was this little girl unbelievably clever, her battle experience and reaction speed were actually not inferior to him. A bodyguard who had once rolled around in the Azura battlefield. And there were so many strange and bizarre ideas. Although the flying dragon centipede had fallen into the thicket, he did not dare to be careless. Subconsciously, he stood in front of Ning Shuama, ready for battle. This kind of brambles would not be able to trap this kind of monster with copper skin and iron armor. It would immediately counterattack. Chirp! The flying dragon centipede suddenly let out an extremely mournful cry. Its huge body suddenly started to roll around in the thorny undergrowth. What was going on? Number 2 was puzzled. Logically speaking, even if the thorns on the thorny undergrowth pierced into the flying dragon centipede's body, it would at most cause a small flesh wound. It should not be able to fight. However, this was not the only thing that made number 2 even more surprised. The flying dragon centipede started to twitch after rolling around in the thicket for a while. After a while, it straightened its body and stopped moving. Dead. Number 2 was stunned for a moment. He stood up and wanted to go down to check. There's no need to check. It's dead. Chapter 135. There's no need to look, it's already dead. Ning Shuama opened her mouth. Her small face was slightly pale as she sat on the branch of a large tree. It seemed like those moves just now had consumed quite a bit of her strength. She spoke carelessly, but her tone was very certain. Number 2 was able to become Ji Yunhao's personal bodyguard, so he had some real skills. His mind was also very quick. He immediately understood. These brambles are poisonous. But he recognized these brambles. They were only slightly poisonous. Being pricked by them would cause a burning pain, but it wouldn't be fatal. Could it be that they were actually the flying dragon centipede's nemesis? He was bewildered and subconsciously wanted to go down and take a look. If you don't want to die like it, then you can go down and take a look. Ning Shuama opened her mouth. Number 2 stopped in his tracks and raised his head to look at her. She was sitting there lazily, her small feet swinging back and forth. She was 3 parts lazy, 6 parts leisurely, and 1 part serious. Was it you who poisoned the brambles? Number 2's guess was pretty close. Ning Shuama swung a branch in her hand and lightly laughed. If your master was here, would you also ask the same question? Number 2 choked. His master was here, so he naturally wouldn't ask. He cupped his hands. My apologies, this subordinate has overstepped his boundaries. Ning Shuama tilted her head and looked at him. She suddenly laughed. Actually, it doesn't matter if I tell you. As long as a vicious creature appears, there will always be food that it likes. But there will also be a nemesis. Just now I tried to look around nearby and found a few juicy plants growing on a hillside. That hillside is where the mole lives. There are many traces of this centipede's activity there, proving that this centipede often forages there. The vegetation there has been destroyed by its large body, leaving only a few plants intact. It's very clear that these plants are its nemesis. So I smeared the juices of these plants on these brambles. Number 2 couldn't help but sigh. You took a bit of a risk. If those plants just happened to not be destroyed, and were not its nemesis, then you'd be in trouble if you blindly came back to provoke it. You shouldn't have come back. Wouldn't you be dead if I didn't come back? I will not leave any of my companions behind. She tilted her head and looked at him again. Although you came uninvited, you've been protecting me in the dark all the way. Companions? She actually treated him as a companion? Number 2's heart warmed even more. A person like him was often used by his master as a spear to attack others and a shield to defend for his master. This was the first time he was treated as a comrade by the person he was protecting. Hot blood seemed to surge in his chest. Originally, he had been sent to secretly protect Ning Shuama. But now all his grievances had turned into gratitude. A light flickered in his eyes as he once again bowed to Ning Shuama. In his heart, he had already made up his mind. He vowed to protect Miss Ning with his life, not because of his mission, but because of the kindness she showed him. Miss Ning, where do you plan to go next? Ning Shuama blinked her eyes and replied with an irrelevant answer. I'm hungry. Number 2 immediately replied, Miss Ning, please wait. This subordinate will go hunting now. It was already afternoon. This place was high above sea level and the forest was dense. Although the sun was still hot outside, the place where Ning Shuama and Number 2 were at was very cool. Chapter 136. It had to be said that Number 2 was a very qualified bodyguard. He was good at fighting, hunting, and barbecuing. A rabbit and a pheasant were roasted by him until they were bright and fragrant. Ning Shuama's appetite was greatly stimulated and she was drooling. She was really hungry. Number 2 tilted his head and saw her sparkling eyes staring at the pheasant. He didn't know why, but he felt a surge of warmth in his heart. A strong urge to protect her, to cherish her, and to give her the best things in the world rose in his heart. He tore off the roasted drumstick and gave it to her. You eat first. He secretly used his psychokinesis to warm the drumstick to room temperature. Thank you. Ning Shuama's eyes curved as she thanked him. She took the drumstick and began to eat. You're welcome. Number 2 was not used to being thanked. What else do you want to eat? I'll continue to roast for you. Chicken wings, rabbit legs, and the meat on its back. Ning Shuama casually said. Good. Just wait, it'll be ready in a while. Number 2 immediately went to roast the rabbit. You don't want to eat a little? Ning Shuama raised the drumstick in her hand. No, it won't be too late for me to eat later. Miss, please enjoy yourself first. Number 2's hands moved quickly. Suddenly he seemed to have sensed something. His hands paused and he looked into the depths of the forest. It smells good. It seems that we're not the only ones on this mountain. There are people from other sects as well. A clear male voice came from the forest. Let's see who it is. A cold female voice followed. This person's barbecue skills are not bad. I'm also hungry. Not bad, not bad. We also hunted some wild game. 4 young men and women walked out from the depths of the forest. There were 2 men and 2 women. They looked to be around 20 years old. The women were wearing white clothes and white skirts. They looked like fairies. The men's white robes fluttered in the wind. Their collars were embroidered with a bird feather pattern. It was obvious that they were from the same sect. They should be disciples of some sect who came here to gain experience. Ning Xuema glanced at them and couldn't help but rub her eyebrows. This white dress was indeed beautiful, but was it really suitable for training in the deep mountains and forests? Aren't you afraid of being targeted by the beasts? Aren't you afraid of being stained with dust? He really wanted to be elegant and not care about his life. The figure of the ancestor flashed through her mind. His white robes were like the clouds and the moon. Comparing him to the snow and frost seemed to stain his color. Could these people be the ancestor's disciples? This style of dressing is very similar. That's not right. The robes of the Sun-Moon sect's disciples were embroidered with cloud patterns, not bird wings. Number 2, who was roasting meat, frowned slightly when he saw the faces of these people. The 4 people naturally saw the 2 people eating the barbecued meat and were surprised. They didn't expect that the person who could enter the 5th mountain would be a little girl who looked about 10 years old. As for the person barbecuing the meat, Number 2, why are you here? Among the 4 people, the coldest girl recognized Number 2's identity. Number 2 could only cup his hands. Miss Zhong. So it was an acquaintance? Ning Xuemo raised her eyebrows. Number 2 didn't have a name? This Miss Zhong actually called him Number 2. Who is this little girl? Miss Zhong sized up Ning Xuemo with her sharp eyes. She couldn't tell who this little girl was. Chapter 137. Who is this little girl? Miss Zhong's sharp eyes scanned Ning Xuemo from head to toe. For a moment she couldn't tell who this little girl was, nor did she see anything special about her. Her tone was condescending. Number 2 was stunned and also looked at Ning Xuemo. He didn't know if he should reveal Ning Xuemo's identity. Ning Xuemo smiled slightly and lazily said, "We're just strangers who met by chance. In the blink of an eye we'll go our separate ways. Why ask for my name? How dare you? My 8th senior sister is giving you face by asking for your name. How dare you be so unappreciative?" The round-faced girl in white who came with Miss Zhong shouted. What an arrogant girl. She had to answer honestly just because they asked her? What kind of twisted logic was this? Ning Xuemo was too lazy to pay attention to her. She turned to Number 2 and urged, "I still want to eat the rabbit leg. Let's roast it ourselves." Miss Zhong and the others were completely ignored. The round-faced girl was obviously someone who often walked sideways. She raised her eyebrows and was about to get angry again when Miss Zhong waved her hand. "Forget it, 9th sister. Why lower yourself to the same level as a child?" She turned to Number 2 and asked, "Number 2, how is your prince?" "Very good. Thank you for your concern. No need to be so polite. When you go back and see your prince, send my regards to him on Rushuang's behalf." "Yes, I'll definitely pass on your message." Zhong Rushuang nodded and said, "Number 2, your roasted game is pretty good. Help us roast it too. 15th brother, give the game in your hands to him to take care of." One of the handsome young men in white nodded his head and placed the meat in his hands in front of Number 2. Number 2 was stunned for a moment and frowned slightly, but he still nodded, "Okay." 8th senior sister, who is he? The round-faced girl asked curiously. "He's the 6th prince's personal bodyguard. I've seen him once in the crown prince's residence, so I recognize him," Zhong Rushuang replied. "Oh, so he's a bodyguard." The round-faced girl spoke quickly and showed a trace of disdain. She immediately stopped being polite. "I want to eat fully roasted. I want to eat the one that's covered in mud and then dried and depilate. I want." The 4 of them each said what they wanted to eat, obviously treating Number 2 as a servant. Those who could come here to train were not ordinary people. Their telekinesis was at least a 6th-order master. These people came here. Their white clothes were not stained with much dust, and they did not look embarrassed. Obviously, their martial arts were not low. This Zhong Rushuang had also entered the crown prince's residence. Could it be that she was an acquaintance of Ji Yunhuang? Ning Xuemo was on the run. She felt that she should keep a low profile and not cause any trouble. But these people's attitudes were really annoying. She actually dared to bully her people in front of her. She was the head of the Secret Service in her previous life, and was usually very protective of her subordinates. She could scold and beat her subordinates when they did something wrong, but she couldn't tolerate others criticizing them. Right now she had already subconsciously treated Number 2 as her subordinate brother, And this group of people was shouting at him like this. Don't you have arms and legs? Roast whatever you want to eat yourself. Ning Shuama's face tensed up as she spoke. What a bold little girl. We're letting him roast meat because we think highly of him. Do you know who we are? The round-faced girl clearly had a fiery temper and exploded at the slightest provocation. Ning Shuama smirked. I don't care who you are. I only know that he's not your servant. There's no reason for him to serve you for free. Even if he agreed, you should at least thank him. Don't you have any manners? Chapter 138. The round-faced girl choked at Zhong Rushuang's question. He's the sixth prince's bodyguard, and we're the crown prince's junior brothers and sisters, Zhong Rushuang said flatly. So we can treat the sixth prince's bodyguard as a servant. Are you satisfied with this answer? Ning Shuama's eyes flashed. They were actually Ji Yunhuang's juniors? Then they were also from the Sun Moon sect? Why didn't they wear the same clothes? Miss Ning, they are disciples of the Bright Reverence School. Their psychokinesis is above the 8th rank of the human realm. We can't afford to offend them. Bear with it. Number 2 suddenly transmitted his voice to Ning Shuama. Bright Reverence School? Ning Shuama quickly searched her mind for the origins of this school. Suddenly, a legend floated into her mind. According to the legend, 300 years ago, the ancestor had made an exception and accepted a female disciple named Yi Qinghuan. Later, for unknown reasons, she was expelled from the school and refused to acknowledge it. That female disciple was also a strong person, so she founded the Bright Reverence School. Bright Reverence actually meant worshipping the sun and moon, implying that she was from the Sun Moon sect. These people claimed to be Ji Yunhuang's juniors. Could it be that they were the direct disciples of the Bright Reverence School's founder, Yi Qinghuan? If Yi Qinghuan was still alive, she would be over 300 years old. Her disciples, on the other hand, were very young. Miss Ning, don't be fooled by their appearance. They are actually over 70 years old. It's just that they have a technique to retain their youthful looks. Number 2 continued to transmit his voice to her. They were actually so old. Psychokinesis was really a mysterious thing. Ning Shuama once again yearned for psychokinesis. Which girl didn't want to retain their youthful looks? Even Ning Shuama was no exception. Only when your psychokinesis breaks through the first rank of the Earth realm can you truly retain your youthful looks. They haven't broken through the Earth realm yet. The reason why they can retain their youthful looks is because their master has a special technique to retain their youthful looks. He also taught it to them. Number 2 continued to explain. Ning Shuama nodded. She felt that she had gained a lot of knowledge. What are you two whispering about? The round-faced girl's face was full of suspicion. There. Isn't that a flying dragon centipede? A white-robed youth suddenly pointed at the thorny thicket and shouted. Like a stone that stirred up 1,000 ripples, the other 3 immediately looked in the direction he was pointing. Zhong Rushuang's eyes lit up. Her usually cold and arrogant face also showed surprise. As expected, we can complete the task that Master gave us. So the long howl we heard just now was indeed from it. I told you, but you didn't believe me. Fortunately, you came here to take a look. This thing has always grown on the 6th summit. Who would have thought that it would actually be found on the 5th summit? We're lucky. That's right. There must be a 6th grade fire crystal in its body. Let's take it back and complete the mission. The 4 of them spoke one after another, and actually treated the flying dragon centipede as their possession. I'll go get the crystal. A white-robed youth volunteered. Just as he was about to fly up, Ning Shuama successfully stopped him with a sentence. This centipede was killed by us. Did you ask for our permission to take it? Zhong Rushuang glanced at Ning Shuama, and then her gaze fell on number 2. Number 2, your martial arts have improved. You can actually hunt the flying dragon centipede alone. It was obvious that she didn't take Ning Shuama seriously. She also didn't expect that Ning Shuama would take the lead in killing the flying dragon centipede. She changed the topic again. This flying dragon centipede is something that my master needs. Give it to us. I'll definitely explain it to your master later. Chapter 139. Number 2 glanced at Ning Shuama, and saw that she was looking at him with a smile that wasn't a smile. His courage was boosted. My apologies, forgive me for not being able to comply. This thing was Ning Shuama's prey, so he had to protect it for her. Although the flying dragon centipede was a monster of the sixth peak, there were very few of them. Even if they wandered around the sixth peak for half a month, they might not be able to find one. Moreover, the fire crystal inside its body was extremely pure, comparable to an 8th grade crystal. It had a price but no market. Even if they wanted to buy it, there was nowhere to buy it. If Ning Shuama could offer this crystal to the imperial court, perhaps the emperor would pardon her for running away from the marriage and give her other rewards. Zhong Rushuang's pretty face sank. You've got guts, daring to refuse me? In this world, not many people dared to refuse the request of a direct descendant of the Bright Reverence sect. Even the disciples of the Sun Moon sect would give them some face. But this little guard in front of her actually dared to say no? My apologies, the fire crystal inside this flying dragon centipede is something that our master wants. Without his personal agreement, forgive me for not being able to comply. Please forgive me, Fairy Zhong. Everyone's skills are profound and you're all dragons and phoenixes among men. Relying on your own strength, you should be able to hunt the flying dragon centipede and report back. Number 2 had no choice but to use Ji Yunhao's name. He couldn't mention Ning Shuama, lest he bring a fatal disaster upon her. Ning Shuama glanced at number 2. Although this guard had a baby face, he was a serious person. She didn't think that he would be able to say something so logical and not offend anyone. Zhong Rushuang paused, her eyes flashing with a hint of sternness, but the corners of her mouth curved slightly. All right, since it's something that the 6th prince wants, we'll go hunt it ourselves. Let's go. Senior sister. The round-faced girl couldn't help but call out, clearly not wanting to give up. Let's go. Zhong Rushuang only said one sentence. The other 3 people's faces were filled with anger, but they couldn't disobey. They glared angrily at Ning Shuama and number 2, then stood up to leave. Brothers and sisters, please wait. Ning Shuama stood up. Zhong Rushuang turned around and glanced at her. What else do you want? Ning Shuama had an apologetic look on her face. We're very sorry that we can't give you the flying dragon centipede crystal. How about you let us grill a few more game for you as an apology? Her voice was sweet, her eyes were clear, and she called out to them intimately. This made these people who were close to 70 years old but still maintained a youthful appearance feel very comfortable. Moreover, they were really hungry, and they were too lazy to roast anything themselves. More importantly, it was difficult to roast it with such perfect color, aroma, and taste. Little girl, you're quite sensible. All right, we'll eat your meal to make you feel at ease. Zhong Rushuang and the other 3 sat down. Number 2 was grumbling in his heart. It wasn't that he didn't want to roast meat for these people, but he had finally managed to get rid of these fiends. Now that Ning Shuama had asked them to stay, he didn't know what unforeseen events would happen if they stayed. The little girl knew their identities. Was she afraid of offending them, so she used this as a gesture of goodwill? He couldn't guess Ning Shuama's thoughts, so he could only go and clean up the game. Ning Shuama ran over and rolled up her sleeves. I'll help you with it. It'll be faster too. Don't let these brothers and sisters starve. Number 2 didn't want her to interfere. He was about to refuse and ask her to go and rest first. However, Ning Shuama smiled at him and winked. Number 2 didn't know what she was up to, so he just let her be. Chapter 140. Zhong Rushuang and the others didn't suspect anything else. They were only a little afraid of the ancestors' children. They didn't care about the other children. What's more, this child spoke so clearly that she was a little girl. Since she was with number 2, it was obvious that she wasn't one of the ancestors' children. What else did they have to be afraid of? One of the youths in white even joked with them. Number 2, this little girl isn't your little wife, is she? Her little face is quite handsome, and her little hands are quite skillful. Number 2 stiffened and subconsciously wanted to refute. Ning Shuama turned around and glared at that person, whispering, no way. She denied it, but her little face turned red. This was simply a disguised admission. The few people looked at each other and laughed in their hearts. This little girl was still too inexperienced. Zhong Rushuang had been a little suspicious and guarded against her. But at this moment, that little bit of vigilance disappeared. The game was roasted very quickly. Just as the few people had expected, it looked, smelled, and tasted good. It whetted their appetite. The round-faced girl was anxious and grabbed a roasted rabbit to start eating. Wait! Zhong Rushuang stopped her. Out of nowhere, she took out a silver needle and pricked the rabbit's body. She then pulled it out to take a look. The silver needle was as bright as before. Only then was she relieved and handed it to the round-faced girl. She was obviously very suspicious. She tested all the game that was passed to them with her silver needle one by one. Only after confirming that it wasn't poisonous did she feel relieved to eat it. Like a whirlwind sweeping away the clouds, it only took a moment for the few wild animals to be reduced to a pile of bones. Zhong Rushuang stood up. Thank you for the game. We should go. She signaled to the others with her eyes. The others also stood up and hastily bid farewell to Ning Shuama and number 2 before walking into the dense forest in the distance. Ning Shuama was still waving enthusiastically at them from behind. Brothers and sisters, take care. I hope you get what you want soon. When did this little girl become so eager to curry favor? Number 2 couldn't help but look at her again, only to find that she was rapidly writing on the ground, "Be careful of their sneak attack. Retreat to the brambles." Number 2 was stunned. And it was at this moment that an unforeseen event occurred. For streaks of golden light accompanied by 4 silhouettes flew towards Ning Shuama and Xiao Luo. Like a thunderbolt or a lightning bolt, it struck the vital points of Ning Shuama and Xiao Taiying. Obviously it was a fatal move right from the start. It didn't give them any chance to survive. Fortunately, with Ning Shuama's warning, the 2 of them were prepared. The 2 of them quickly retreated, as if they were in a panic, and directly jumped into the thorny undergrowth. Zhong Rushuang also did not expect that the 4 people's joint attack would not work. When she raised her head to look, she saw Ning Shuama and number 2 standing on top of the thorny undergrowth, looking at them. The little girl seemed to be quite angry. She opened her eyes wide and asked, "Why do you want to kill us?" Since her purpose had already been exposed, Zhong Rushuang decided not to hide it any longer. "Because you must die." The crystal pillar in the flying dragon centipede's body was theirs. However, they didn't want to become enemies with the imperial family of Chongkong country, so they chose to silence them to prevent future trouble. The round-faced girl sneered and added, "Originally, we wanted to give you a quick death because you helped us roast meat. We didn't expect you to be so tactless. Don't blame us for being merciless. If you know what's good for you, then you too should stop your pointless struggle. Obediently accept your death." The young man in white also smiled proudly. Chapter 141. If you kill yourselves, we can still leave your corpses intact. Who knows, maybe we'll even bury you properly if we're in a good mood, so that your corpses won't be exposed in the wilderness. Another young man also laughed happily. The 4 of them began to approach the thorny thicket step by step. "You're too much of a bully." Ning Shuama stomped her foot, but she forgot that she was standing on thorny thickets. Her foot missed a step and she fell down with a cry, "Miss Ning." Number 2 hurriedly flew down to catch her. The thorny thicket was as tall as a person. When the 2 jumped down, they disappeared without a trace. Zhong Rushuang narrowed her eyes. Could it be that there was a trap in this thicket? She sneered in her heart. No need to chase after them. Use the flying locust formation to finish them off. She took the lead and the golden light in her hand swept towards the thorny thicket. The 4 of them were obviously used to working together. They cooperated well and attacked the thorny thicket from 4 different directions. The 4 of them were very strong. These thick and hard thorny thickets were like paper under their attacks. Branches were cut off one by one. The thorny thickets danced in the air and juice splashed everywhere. Like a lawnmower, they advanced towards the place where Ning Shuama and number 2 had fallen. Zhong Rushuang's lips curved into a cruel smile. The place where Ning Shuama and the others were hiding was where the flying dragon centipede's corpse was. They still needed to get the crystal. No matter what, they had to clean up the thorny thickets around them so that it would be convenient for them to make a move. Now they had to silence them and clean up the scene. After she killed number 2 and the little girl, she would use the corpse dissolving powder to dissolve their bodies. This way they would be able to do it without anyone knowing. The 4 of them were eager to accomplish their mission, and did not care about the thorny thickets around them. In just a moment, they attacked the place where the flying dragon centipede was lying. Zhong Rushuang could already see the corner of number 2's robe. "Aya, my head hurts." The round-faced girl suddenly cried out and hugged her head. This bastard, he's taking the opportunity to be lazy again. Zhong Rushuang cursed under her breath. She was about to scold him when she suddenly felt a sharp object hitting her head. The pain was unbearable. She couldn't help but let out a low cry and subconsciously touched her head. It was as if countless sharp thorns had drilled into her head in a split second and were stabbing her in all directions. It was so painful that she let out another blood-curdling scream. Her hands trembled and her legs went limp as she fell to the ground. The other three didn't fare any better. Like her, they rolled to the ground. It was obvious that they were in extreme pain. They could no longer care about their elegant and graceful appearances as they rolled around and screamed miserably. His voice was mournful and shrill, causing the surrounding birds to fly away in disarray. Ning Xuema and number 2 emerged from the thicket of brambles. The two of them had been hiding behind the flying dragon centipede just now. With the flying dragon centipede's body as a shield, the two of them were unharmed. Number 2 looked at the 4 people who were rolling on the ground, and then looked at Ning Xuema, who was standing there with her arms crossed and a smile on her face. What happened to them? Poisoned. Ning Xuema spat out 2 words and looked coldly at them, struggling and crying. Number 2 was puzzled. He had never seen Ning Xuema use poison. Could it be that she had released the poison in the thicket? That didn't seem right either. It didn't make sense that those people had been poisoned, but he, who was also in the thicket, didn't feel anything. However, when he saw that the 4 of them were lying down, he breathed a sigh of relief. If they really wanted to fight, he and Ning Xuema were no match for them at all. They could only wait for death. Now they had escaped disaster. Chapter 142. You poisoned them? He couldn't help but ask. Ning Xuema's lips curled slightly. What do you think? She kicked the ball back to him. Number 2 finally shut his mouth and stopped asking. Stupid girl, what the hell are you doing? Give us the antidote. Zhong Rushuang endured the pain and shouted. Does it hurt? Ning Xuema charmingly stood at the top of the brambles. She was trembling, but she didn't fall. Little girl, if you give us the antidote, we'll let bygones be bygones. One of the youths in white had already rolled into a gray one. He also knew that this wasn't the time to be stubborn, so he began to try to appease them. Give you the antidote so that you can kill us to silence us? Are you out of your mind? Or do you think I'm out of my mind? Ning Xuema was still smiling, but the words she said were infuriating. We won't kill you. Just now. We were just joking with you to scare you and make you hand over the fire crystals. We didn't really want to kill you. Zhong Rushuang endured the pain and tried to jump up several times, but the pain had already begun to spread from her forehead to her entire body. Wherever it went, it felt like knives and axes were cutting her. She couldn't even sit up, let alone jump up to take revenge. Is that so? Ning Xuema pursed her lips and smiled, rudely exposing her lie. Aren't you afraid that this matter will reach the crown prince's ears, and that you won't be able to explain yourself to him? So you want to kill us to silence us, then destroy the evidence and be done with it? Zhong Rushuang's face turned pale. This little girl had guessed correctly. At this point, she could only refuse to admit it. Little girl, you're wrong. It's not like that. We really didn't mean to harm you. If we really wanted to kill you, we would have done it when you were barbecuing. You didn't do it when you were barbecuing because you didn't know our real situation. You saw how the flying dragon centipede died at our hands, so you didn't know how powerful our martial arts were. You wanted to kill us in one shot, so you attacked when we were least prepared. Besides, you were really hungry and greedy for our cooking. Ning Xuema counted with her fingers. Zhong Rushuang's face turned even paler. She did not expect that her scheme would be so transparent in front of this little girl. She could actually see through it so thoroughly. TSK, it said that those who take advantage of others have a short mouth, and those who take advantage of others have a short hand. I see that your mouths aren't short, but your hands aren't short either. After eating and drinking other people's food, you kill them to silence them and steal their things. Is this the style of your bright reverence cult? How shameless! Zhong Rushuang was speechless. Even if she was thick-skinned, she still felt a little embarrassed after being exposed by this little girl in front of her. Little girl, how good are you? You poisoned the meat just now, didn't you? So you've been scheming against us all along. Zhong Rushuang was not stupid. After thinking for a while, she realized something and could not help but retort. But she had tested it before eating it, and it wasn't poisonous. Ah, you're not stupid. Ning Xuema giggled. However, you're only half right. I did put a kind of poison in the game you ate. This kind of poison isn't poison at all if you eat it alone. It's just a kind of seasoning. If you really left after eating it and didn't scheme against us, nothing would have happened. But you ate it and even schemed against us to kill us. The juice in the thorns is actually a kind of poison. This kind of poison isn't poison on its own, but when it's mixed with the poison I put in the game, it becomes an intestinal poison. Chapter 143. Zhong Rushuang. So that's how it is. This little girl's mind is so meticulous, what a sinister scheme. Number 2 also admired Ning Xuema very much. Originally, it was a battle of life and death, but he did not expect that she would be able to resolve it so easily without spilling blood. It seems that she had already seen through the conspiracy of these people at that time. How could such a small person have such keen observation skills? She was even more mature than him. A person who had been rolling on the edge of a knife all year round. But how should he deal with these people? These people were from Bright Reverend School. The sect master of Bright Reverend School was very protective of his disciples, and all of them were arrogant and willful, not allowing anyone to humiliate them. If he killed them, the sect master would not let it go and would seek revenge for his disciples. Moreover, she was also able to communicate with yin and yang, and knew the soul summoning technique. Even if he killed all of these people and destroyed their corpses, it would be useless. Yi Qinghuan would summon the souls of his disciples to track down the murderer. At that time, if she chased him to the ends of the earth, he and Ning Xuema wouldn't be able to escape. Their deaths would be incomparably miserable. Moreover, what she killed wasn't only the body but also the soul. But if he let these people go, once they turned around they would also counterattack. At that time, he and Ning Xuema would still not be able to escape death. Kill he could not kill, but keep he also could not keep. Number 2 was in a dilemma for a moment, and he transmitted his concerns to Ning Xuema. Ning Xuema originally wanted to give them a taste of their own medicine and kill these people to silence them, but when she heard his concerns she frowned slightly. Soul summoning technique? This technique was really too hateful. She could kill people, but she could not use a technique to disperse the souls of people. No wonder these people from Bright Reverend School dared to run rampant and no one dared to provoke them. It turned out that they had such an abnormal master, and that master was the disciple of the ancestor. It seemed that the ancestor was also abnormal. His own disciple was so tyrannical. Did he not know how to clean up the sect? And I heard that Yi Qinghuan was his only female disciple. Could it be that there was some unspeakable secret? Like the love between a master and a disciple in some Xianxia novels? The image of the ancestor's snow-white figure appeared in her mind. TSK. He really looked like the cold master in the abusive relationship between master and disciple. He only took in one female disciple but expelled her from the sect. Then, her love turned into hate and she became Abbess Miju. TSK, what a melodramatic drama of love and hate, of not being able to get what one loves. After Yi Qinghuan, the ice sculpture-like venerable overlord did not accept any female disciple, and turned a blind eye to her actions. Could it be that he had promised her something and felt guilty about it? Ning Xuema glanced at the 4 people who were rolling around in pain and sweating profusely. The matter between the Dizun and his disciple had nothing to do with her. The people in front of her were the real trouble. How could she settle this peacefully? The round-faced girl screamed in pain, "Bitch! You're dead for sure this time. How dare you scheme against us? When I recover I will skin you and pull out your tendons. I'll let you have a taste of what it's like to beg for death." Zhong Rushuang could clearly see number 2's hesitation, and naturally knew what he was worried about. She took a deep breath and said, "If you know what's good for you, you'll cure our poison now and I won't make things difficult for you. We'll go our separate ways. If you're late, our enmity will be set. We'll definitely chase you to the ends of the earth." This condition was relatively tempting. Number 2 immediately looked at Ning Xuema. Chapter 144. Ning Xuema smiled faintly. "What do you think? If you cure us of the poison, we'll spare your lives. The white-robed youth was in a sorry state, but his tone was arrogant. In his heart, he added, "I'll only torture you and turn you into human rods. We'll talk after you cure us of the poison." Another youth spoke up. All four of them were sweating profusely and were in a sorry state. "What should we do?" "Lady Ning, these four people are vengeful people." Number 2 transmitted his voice again, stuck between a rock and a hard place. Ning Shuama seemed to be in a difficult position as she thought about it. Then sighed, "Aya, this is really a dilemma. Let me think about it." Number 2, "Let's ignore them for now. We'll talk about it after we get the fire crystal." Yes. Number 2 also decided not to dwell on this difficult problem for the time being, and went to kill the flying dragon centipede to get the crystal. Zhong Rushuang and the others were so angry that their noses almost went crooked. This damned girl could take her time to think. But they were being tortured here and they didn't want to wait a moment longer. The four of them were there. Some were threatening, some were tempting, some were cursing, some were red-faced and some were white-faced. They wanted to trick Ning Shuama into curing them of the poison first. Unfortunately, Ning Shuama didn't seem to have any intention of paying attention to them. She crossed her arms and excitedly watched Number 2 retrieve the crystal. This flying dragon centipede had copper skin and iron bones. In order to peel off its skin and flesh, one had to start from a small hole in its abdomen. Then one had to peel it off bit by bit like tearing off iron. It was very time-consuming. Ning Shuama didn't seem to be impatient at all. She watched with great interest. On the other hand, every moment was torture for those few people. Cold sweat broke out all over their bodies, and the clothes on their bodies had already been rolled into a mess. After 2 hours, their willpower was finally defeated. They no longer dared to curse, only begging and crying. The round-faced girl even knelt on the ground and kowtowed repeatedly. 4 hours later, Number 2 finally took out a blood-red crystal that was about 2 feet long from the flying dragon centipede's body. As soon as the crystal appeared, it flashed with a dazzling brilliance, illuminating the surroundings with a fiery red glow. The four of them were now rolling on the ground. They didn't even have the strength to beg for mercy. They were lying there like dead dogs. Number 2 was also sweating profusely. He wiped the fire crystal clean and handed it to Ning Shuama. "Miss Ning, please put it away." Ning Shuama took it and looked at it, then threw it back to him. "You can keep it. I don't need it." She was not interested in the crystal. Moreover, this thing was so heavy that it was too burdensome to carry. She still had to go up the mountain to pick herbs. Number 2 was speechless. He thought that Ning Shuama didn't know the value of this crystal. He couldn't help but say, "Miss Ning, this crystal is extremely rare. With a little polishing, it will become a good tool to test fire psychokinesis. Moreover, cultivators with water attribute psychokinesis can use it to set up arrays during cultivation. It can also prevent them from going berserk. Fire and water mutually restrained each other. When a cultivator with water psychokinesis overcultivated, the yin energy in their body would be greatly increased. Only by using a fire attribute crystal to neutralize the yin energy would they be able to resolve this crisis. Looking at your psychokinesis, it should be of the water attribute." Ning Shuama glanced at him. "Then I'll give it to you." Although this imperial bodyguard was Ji Yunhao's imperial bodyguard, his character was extremely loyal to his friends. He was also relatively straightforward and candid. Ning Shuama had always respected this kind of man. Moreover, he was currently her companion, so Ning Shuama didn't feel any heartache when she gave him the crystal. Chapter 145. Number 2 looked at the fire crystal in his hand, then looked at Ning Shuama. His eyes flickered. He thanked her and solemnly put away the fire crystal. He didn't say any more words of gratitude. Some favors needed to be engraved in his heart, not expressed verbally. "Lady Ning, where are we going now?" "Zhu Yufeng, to pick herbs." Ning Shuamo replied. "Hey Lady Ning, you help us detoxify the poison first. We were willing to help you fight. Zhu Yufeng has a guardian beast. You can't beat it." Zhong Rushuang forced herself to speak. Ning Shuama slowly walked over and squatted in front of her, looking at her. "Are you planning to cut me into pieces after detoxifying the poison?" "No, definitely not. I'm willing to swear." Zhong Rushuang finally saw a glimmer of hope. How could she let it go? She hurriedly promised. All right, then make an oath. If you break the oath, then your master will never be forgiven by the ancestor, and will never be able to return to the Sun Moon sect. Number 2 interjected from the side. Zhong Rushuang's expression changed greatly. How can we implicate our master? If you don't have any intention of breaking the oath, why would you implicate your master? Number 2 didn't back down. Ning Shuama also smiled gently at the side. You don't even dare to swear such an oath. It's clear that you don't have any sincerity. Okay, I swear. I won't seek revenge on you too. If I break the oath, my master. Zhong Rushuang followed Ning Shuama's instructions and repeated the oath. The other 3 saw her swear, and in order to survive, they followed suit and swore the same oath. Number 2 let out a long sigh of relief. Lady Ning, detoxify them. They won't dare to break the oath. Ning Shuama also knew that the people of the Tianxi continent valued oaths the most. It was said that if an oath was broken, it would quickly be fulfilled. Thus, once the people here made an oath, they wouldn't break it again. Even if they had great grievances, they would have to let go. 2 hours later, Ning Shuama and number 2 were already on their way to Falling Flower Peak. Miss Ning, didn't you say you wanted to go to Vermilion Jade Peak? Number 2 was puzzled. The direction they were currently heading in was clearly the opposite direction. That was to fool those 4 people. Ning Shuama didn't even turn her head. Number 2 said. The 4 of them swore that they wouldn't seek revenge on us. Their martial arts aren't bad, and they're willing to help us. It's a good idea to have them open a path for us. They only promised that they wouldn't seek revenge on us, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't come up with any bad ideas along the way. For example, they would deliberately lure some ferocious beasts to attack us, or deliberately bring us to some dangerous place. Even if we were really in danger, do you think they would reach out and save us? Rather than being on guard all the time, it's better to go our own way. Number 2 was stunned for a moment. He deeply felt that what Ning Shuama said was indeed reasonable, and didn't say anything else. Speaking of which, their master Yi Qinghuan really knows the soul tracking technique? Ning Shuama was still a little doubtful. Actually, according to her temperament, when she subdued those 4 people, she wanted to kill them cleanly. She didn't want to rack her brains and expend all her energy to subdue them, so as to avoid any future troubles. However, Yi Qinghuan's soul tracking technique did make her somewhat apprehensive. She was still very weak now, but that Yi Qinghuan's martial arts had already reached Earth rank level 8. She had hundreds of disciples under her, and was already a powerful existence on this continent. Chapter 146. If such a person wanted to take Ning Shuama's life, Ning Shuama would have no chance to escape. Fighting against such a big boss when she was still very weak was undoubtedly like a mantis trying to stop a chariot, or an ant trying to shake a tree. It was too irrational. Number 2 nodded and told her a few stories about how Yi Qinghuan used the soul tracking technique to find out the cause of her disciples' deaths, and used cruel methods to take revenge. Every one of them was hair-raising, and every one of them died very miserably. One of them was even a prince of a certain country, because he accidentally killed a disciple of Bright Reverence. Bright Reverence sought revenge and burned him alive on the city wall. Even the emperor of that country was angry but didn't dare to say anything. Ning Shuama frowned slightly. It seemed that this Yi Qinghuan was even more abnormal than that Abbess Miju. She was so tyrannical, yet the ancestor didn't care about her. It seemed that he had some kind of special feelings for her. How did Yi Qinghuan get expelled by the ancestor? Number 2 shook his head. This is an old matter from 300 years ago. No one knows the specific reason. Sun Moon Sect and Bright Reverence both kept their mouths shut. I only heard that the ancestor had taken her as a disciple for 3 years, and then ordered her to be expelled. He never saw her again. Ning Shuama listened to the gossip with great interest. Then how do you know that she wants to return to the sect? After all, she has already become the founder of a sect. How good is it to be a founder? Being someone's disciple and being restricted and controlled. Number 2 sighed. Senior Yi wants to return to the Sun Moon sect. The entire Tianxi continent knows about it. Unfortunately, the ancestor doesn't want to let her go. He even refuses to see her. I heard that Senior Yi tried every method but still couldn't see him. This ancestor was really arrogant. It seemed that this Yi Qingwan really loved the ancestor. The ancestor shouldn't be completely heartless towards her, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't have let her run amok. Perhaps he was apprehensive about the status of master and disciple. The ancestor was a very prideful ancestor. He wouldn't allow himself to have such a stain on his reputation. Therefore, he decided to expel Yi Qingwan from the sect. But in his heart he probably couldn't let it go, right? For the past 300 years he must have been entangled. Although he had expelled Yi Qingwan from his sect, he would no longer take in any female disciples, making Yi Qingwan his only female disciple. TSK, why does this scene look so familiar? It was like the Xianxia TV series she had just watched before she transmigrated. She didn't expect to see a living one in this world. By the way, is Yi Qingwan married? Is the ancestor married yet? Number 2 looked at her rather strangely. Although Senior Ye's temperament is a bit strange, she is extremely self-disciplined and has never had any physical contact with men. Of course, she is also not married. She had many female disciples. Even if she had male disciples, they would be taught by the female disciples. Therefore, the status of the male disciples was lower. As for the ancestor was a god. Which mortal woman could be worthy of him? Naturally, he's unmarried. Although the master and disciple did not meet each other, the man and the woman remained unmarried. What a torturous relationship between master and disciple. The two of them chatted as they walked, and soon arrived at the foot of the falling flower peak. There was a kind of strange herb growing on the falling flower peak. It was called the heavenly ice grass. When combined with other herbs, it could improve a person's physique. It had the effect of washing the muscles and changing the marrow. Ning Xuema had been studying this thing recently. She had already prepared all the other herbs except for this one. Moreover, this kind of herb had to be quickly consumed the moment it was picked in order to have the corresponding effect. Chapter 147. Since Ning Xuema decided to come here to pick herbs, she naturally did her homework. She knew that this herb only grew in the shade of Falling Flower Peak, and that there were 2 kinds of poisonous insects protecting the place where the herb grew. One was a poisonous snake and the other was a scorpion. The snake was a golden star demon snake, and the scorpion was a heavenly star demon scorpion. Both of them were poisonous insects with a 3rd-level psychokinesis. Although their psychokinesis was not high, there were many of them. It was said that there were nests of these snakes and scorpions on the peak. It was comparable to the Snake Island and the Scorpion Island, because there was only one herb on this mountain peak, and this herb only had one effect and one harsh consumption condition. There was almost no one who would come here to collect this herb over the years. Number 2 naturally heard of this place. When he first heard that Ning Xuema wanted to come here, his first thought was that this girl was crazy. He knew that she had a useless physique, but she couldn't sacrifice her life just to improve her useless physique. He thought that Ning Xuema didn't know the dangers of this place, so he opened his mouth to explain to her. Unexpectedly, just as he opened his mouth, Ning Xuema cut him off. I know all of this. I've done my research before, so I know what to do. Number 2, you don't need to come with me. You can just stay at the foot of the peak. I have my own way of picking herbs. This was her business and she didn't want to make it difficult for others to take the risk with her. Number 2 was silent for a moment. He took off the fire crystal on his back and hid it in a hidden tree hole. Then he said, I'll go with you. Your Highness is not here. You don't need to follow the rules. You must protect me. Miss Ning, you don't need to persuade me. I've made up my mind. I'll go wherever Miss Ning goes. He didn't do it for the rules or for the 6th king. He was a guard and knew how to avoid harm. If it was only for the 6th king's orders, he would do his best. He wouldn't pledge his life to follow him. He only did it for her. Ning Xuema looked at his determined face and knew that he had made up his mind. She couldn't persuade him anymore. She simply said, okay, I can take you with me. But you must listen to me on the peak. You can't make any mistakes. Yes. Number 2 looked at her suddenly serious little face and his heart skipped a beat. This girl actually had the aura of a king at this moment, and he didn't dare to disobey her. What happened next was simply a bizarre and frightening nightmare for number 2. When they were about to reach the peak, Ning Xuema sprayed some kind of medicine on him. She sprayed it from head to toe, not sparing a single inch of his skin. The smell was strong, strange, and unpleasant. She also sprayed herself with the same spray before swaggering up to the peak with him. The first thing they saw was a snake. Large and small golden snakes were in nests. The big ones were as thick as anacondas, while the small ones were nearly a meter long. They were coiled on the rocks, wriggling in the cracks and hanging from the trees. They could be seen everywhere. Strands of snakes could be seen everywhere. It was a dazzling sight. Number 2 could be considered brave, but when he saw so many snakes, he couldn't help but feel his scalp go numb and his entire body turn cold. This kind of snake was extremely poisonous. If one was bitten by it, one would immediately die. Even a golden immortal would not be able to save them. There were no roads on the peak, only some traces left by the snakes. Number 2 suppressed his disgust and fear. According to Ning Xuema's instructions, he held his breath and slowly walked forward. Chapter 148. Strangely enough, there were snakes under their feet and on both sides of them, but not a single snake attacked them. It was as if they didn't exist at all. Without a doubt, it was the strange liquid that Ning Xuema sprayed on her body. At this time, Number 2 was still full of admiration for Ning Xuema. Girls were generally afraid of snakes. He had once seen a so-called psychokinesis genius scream like a pig being slaughtered when she saw a snake. Now in this kind of snake nest, even he was so scared that his face turned white. He had to control his legs to stop them from trembling. But he never thought that Ning Xuema, this little girl, would be able to walk through the snake array like this. She walked so lightly and without a change in expression. Even a meter-long golden snake fell from a big tree and landed on her neck. Number 2 was so scared that he broke out in a cold sweat. Ning Xuema didn't even blink. She didn't even pay attention to the snake on her neck. She only stood there, allowing the snake to slither around her body once before leaving while shaking its head and wagging its tail. Which bastard said that Marquis Ning's daughter was a coward and had no place to be? The person who said that must be blind. From what he had seen and heard along the way, this girl was an unprecedented genius. Smart, intelligent, bold, meticulous, ambitious, and had a body full of strange skills. He was better than her father, if not better. Whoever could marry this girl would have a good fortune that couldn't be accumulated even in 8 lifetimes. It was a pity that their marquis didn't have this good fortune and missed out on such an excellent girl. They passed through the snake array without any danger. Although Number 2 was so scared that he broke out in a cold sweat, he was still able to hold on. Other than his face turning white, he didn't look out of place. What medicine did they spray on us just now? They seem to think that we are the same kind. Number 2 couldn't help but be curious. Ning Xuema put a snow-white finger to her lips and smiled. It's a secret recipe. Number 2. Since it was a secret, it wasn't convenient for him to ask. He looked ahead. There should be more scorpion arrays, right? Will the smell on our bodies still work? Add one more. Ning Xuema's reply was concise and comprehensive. She took out 2 small bottles of medicine and sprayed them all over. This time the smell was even stranger. It was so pungent that Number 2 almost sneezed. Why does it smell like chicken poop? Number 2 almost wanted to pinch his nose. The smell was going to kill him. Ning Xuema's eyes curved. Do you want to make the scorpions avoid you because you stink? Or make the scorpions come to you because you smell good? Alright, he would endure it for now. At this moment, they had already entered the depths of the mountain. The 2 of them finally saw the scorpion here. The number of scorpions was much smaller than the number of snakes, and they all moved alone. The big ones were as big as a pipa, and the small ones were as big as round fans. Each of them moved as fast as lightning, and their tails were raised high like flags. Number 2's heart was filled with uncertainty. He knew that the smell on his body was the smell of a large rooster. It was said that scorpions were afraid of chickens, but with such a large scorpion that was even bigger than a rooster, would it be afraid? But he was clearly worrying too much. Their natural enemy was their natural enemy. The scorpions here were afraid of chickens. They were afraid of the smell of chicken poop on their bodies. Wherever they went, the scorpions on the side of the road would quickly run away. In the blink of an eye, they would dive into the grass. They were simply unstoppable. Chapter 149. Everyone regarded this place as a dangerous place, but now it seems that as long as you find the right method, this place is very easy to pass. It's not that scary. In the future, if he came here to pick herbs, he would bring a rooster or smear some chicken dung on his body. It was just that the snake array was not easy. Until now he still could not figure out what the smell was, let alone concocting it. Don't get any ideas. Ning Shuama opened her mouth, obviously seeing through his thoughts. Normal roosters don't have it either. The smell on our bodies right now is the smell of the sky rooster, the natural enemy of this scorpion. So that's how it is. Number 2 could not help but look at her again. The little girl in front of him seemed to be very well prepared, and her research on this place was very thorough. It seems that this little girl did not risk her life to come here. She already had a card up her sleeve. The two of them turned around a hillside, and suddenly their eyes lit up. In front of them was a sea of stars. No, it was a field of grass that looked like stars. There were 40 to 50 grasses densely packed together, each of them more than a foot tall. They were light blue in color, and their leaves were round and plump like little stars. There was a thin layer of frost on top of them, and they were emitting a faint glow from the setting sun, emitting waves of fragrance. Heavenly ice grass. He did not think that there would be so many here. Number 2's eyes lit up, and he wanted to rush over. Ning Shuama gestured for him to stop. Then, she took out a dagger with a crimson luster from her bosom. Take out your weapon. Number 2 was shocked. She didn't want to duel with him here, right? Miss Ning, don't worry, all the herbs here can belong to you. I won't take a single one. Ning Shuama glared at him. Stop talking nonsense. Take out your weapon, I'll smear some medicine on it. There are other kinds of poisonous snakes and scorpions in the grass, and you must use a special medicine to kill them. So that's how it is. Number 2 let out a sigh of relief, and handed his sword to her. Ning Shuama took out a transparent medicine and smeared it on the blade, and then handed it to him. Use it sparingly, I only have this much. Remember, we'll each pick one herb and leave. Don't be greedy. She spoke in a dignified manner, causing number 2 to be stunned. This one can also pick one? Of course. Since you've entered the treasure mountain, how can I let you return empty-handed? This herb can slightly increase your aptitude. Once you pluck it, swallow the leaves immediately. The stalk is inedible. Remember. Number 2's heart was filled with gratitude as he said in a low voice, thank you. In the vast sky country, no matter what treasure they found, it would belong to their master. Even if there was a large patch of medicinal herbs, their master would monopolize it and would not let them touch a single bit. Only if they had made a huge contribution would they be able to receive the slightest bit of reward from the master. But now, for some unknown reason, he could only pick 2 stalks. Ning Shuama didn't even hesitate to give him 1 stalk. For this kind of girl, even if he sacrificed his life, it would still be hard for him to repay her. Number 2 took a deep breath and said, Miss Ning, can we only pick 2? This humble one doesn't want it. Miss needs it more than this humble one does. Don't talk nonsense. If I tell you to pick one, then pick one. Remember, when you pick the herbs, pay attention to the stalk. Poisonous creatures will fly out from there. Yes, sir. Number 2 replied. Ning Shuama's eyes curved. Good, then let's begin. She flew towards the patch of heavenly ice grass. Chapter 150. When she was right in front of him, the dagger in her right hand flashed and killed a red snake that flew out from the bushes. Her left hand took the opportunity to grab a stalk of heavenly ice grass. With a flick of her fingers, the star-like leaves of the heavenly ice grass flew into her mouth. She took advantage of the situation and stepped back 3 feet. Number 2 had been paying attention to her movements. He was quick and nimble, so he copied her movements and acted almost at the same time as her. He first killed a scorpion and then picked the grass to eat. This set of actions was as smooth as moving clouds and flowing water. But after he picked 1 stalk, he suddenly thought that since Miss Ning had treated him so well, he might as well pick another stalk for her as a form of repayment. So he did not retreat, but went to pick the 2nd stalk, careful. 3 black shadows flew out from the bushes, 2 red and 1 gray, and bit at him like lightning. At the same time, 2 silver lights flashed from behind him and went straight for 2 of the black shadows. He hurriedly waved his right hand, and the sword in his palm struck down one of the black shadows. The black shadow that was hit by the silver light only paused for a moment before opening its mouth and spitting out 2 balls of faint purple mist. Number 2 only managed to dodge one of the balls, but was hit by the other one. The stench hit his nose and his mind went blank. His vision turned black, and his body fell towards the heavenly ice grass. Idiot! Ning Xuema did not have time to catch him, so she could only kick him quickly. Before he could fall to the ground, he kicked him and sent him flying. Number 2 fell into an open space. The rock beneath him was hard, and he groaned as his body curled up slightly. Who told you to pick more? Did you take my words for granted? Even if you want to die, this is not the way to do it. Ning Xuema flew back in time. In her anger, she scolded him. Number 2's face turned green, and the blood in his chest was boiling. He also knew that he had caused trouble, so he shrank his neck after being scolded. I'm sorry. His hand was still tightly holding the stalk of heavenly ice grass, and he trembled as he handed it over. This grass was not easy to get. Please eat another one. So he picked the extra one for her. Ning Xuema looked at his increasingly green face, and her anger did not dissipate. Idiot! Who asked you to be so nosy? Do you think I wouldn't do it if I could? Are you a pig? Don't you know how to use your brain before doing anything? Bodyguard number 2 had known her for a long time and had often seen her smiling face, but this was the first time he had seen her so angry. When she was angry, there was a kind of fierce aura that made him shrink his neck back and half lie there like a frightened quail. When he opened his eyes, he saw that Ning Xuema had turned around and was flying towards the heavenly ice grass. He was shocked. Where are you going? Shut up. Be good and stay there. I'll go and find the antidote for you. Number 2 had already experienced how dangerous that patch of grass was. Seeing her like this, he almost cried. You don't have to look for it anymore. My lowly life is not worth it. Ning Xuema ignored him. After traveling with number 2 for so long, she had already subconsciously treated him as her subordinate. Although her subordinate had made a stupid mistake, she couldn't just watch him lose his life like this. Bodyguard number 2 had been injured by a poisonous mist spat out by a poisonous snake. If he wasn't rescued in time, bodyguard number 2 would be finished in less than an hour. The only antidote for this poison was the snake's gallbladder. That snake had already been injured by her silver needle, and now it had already slithered back into the grass. She had to find it again. Chapter 151. The snakes and scorpions around the heavenly ice grass all had a special characteristic. Every stalk of grass had a snake and a scorpion under it, and they wouldn't cross the boundary between each other. If they only took one stalk, they only needed to kill one snake. But if they took a second stalk, it would arouse the vigilance of these poisonous creatures. They would help each other, and it would be hard to say what kind of attack they would receive. Fortunately, these poisonous snakes and scorpions only cared about protecting their own herbs. As long as they didn't touch those herbs, they would be very obedient and wouldn't attack. They would only stare at the intruder with their small eyes. The poisonous snake that attacked number 2 should be at the place where he picked the herbs, and it should be the 2 stalks right next to him. Therefore, Ning Xuema carefully searched for a moment and finally found the whereabouts of those 2 fellows. Her silver needles were still stuck in their bodies. She couldn't touch the herbs they were hiding in, or else it would attract the attacks of the surrounding poisonous creatures. She only flicked out 2 more anesthetic needles. After a moment, she finally came back with the 2 fainted poisonous snakes. Although it was one of the snakes that attacked number 2, these 2 fellows looked exactly the same. Ning Xuema couldn't figure out which one was the culprit, so she simply brought them both back. In just a moment, number 2 was already foaming at the mouth, and his face was as green as grass. He slightly opened his eyes and forced himself not to faint. When he saw that Ning Xuema had returned safely, he let out a sigh of relief. His eyes rolled back and he fainted. He was woken up by the bitter taste. It was as if he had swallowed 2 caddies of Chinese gold thread. It was so bitter that his tongue was almost numb. He subconsciously wanted to vomit, but a finger touched his lips. Try it if you dare. Swallow it. The lass wasn't big, but her aura wasn't small. Number 2 steeled his heart and forced his neck to swallow the gallbladder in his mouth. After a moment, Ning Shuama looked at his still green face and sighed. It seems like it's not that one. As she spoke, she took out another snake's gallbladder and put it next to his mouth. This one should be it. Come swallow this one. With a bitter face, Number 2 had no choice but to swallow the second snake gallbladder. Clearly, this bitter rose gallbladder was the right medicine. His complexion gradually improved, and the dizziness in his head and the pain in his stomach gradually disappeared. His little life could be considered to have been pulled back from the gates of hell by Ning Shuama. He had already obtained the medicinal herbs, but there were many poisonous insects here, so he couldn't stay for long. Therefore, after Number 2 recovered, Ning Shuama began to make arrangements for descending the mountain. Although the poison in Number 2's body had been neutralized, it was still a potent poison. He did not have much strength left in his body and could only force himself to walk. Ning Shuama finished tidying everything up and looked at his deathly pale face. Can you leave or not? Why don't you rest a little longer? Number 2 shook his head. No need, going down the mountain is not a problem. He couldn't implicate her anymore. This place was too dangerous. Every second counted. Ning Shuama didn't force him. Seeing that he was walking steadily, she was relieved. She also wanted to leave this poisonous nest as soon as possible. The two of them used the same method as when they came, and as expected, they were not attacked by any scorpions or poisonous snakes. Just as they were about to walk out of the array of golden snakes, the sky suddenly darkened, and the wind suddenly blew. The golden snakes that were peacefully swimming in the surroundings suddenly panicked and slithered into the cracks, caves, and bushes nearby. In the blink of an eye, more than 1,000 snakes had disappeared without a trace. Chapter 152. Ning Shuama was speechless. She raised her head instinctively and saw a large patch of dark clouds flying towards them. They were not dark clouds, they were flying birds. Eagles. But wasn't this eagle a little too big? There were more than 10 of them and they covered half the sky. Under the moonlight, their silhouettes could be vaguely seen. They had golden eyes and black feathers. Each of them was the size of a small house. When they spread their wings, they looked like gliders as they flew straight towards them. Number 2 also saw the appearance of those eagles and his expression changed drastically. He cried out, "Golden-eyed eagles! They are level 8 magic birds from the 9th peak. Heavens, they actually came here. Level 8 magic birds." Ning Shuama was speechless. They could not afford to offend them. Hide! Ning Shuama pulled Number 2 and ran. Eagles were the natural enemies of snakes. Naturally, they were coming for these golden snakes. However, if they saw the two of them standing here alive, they would definitely eat them as snacks. There was a small cave not far away. They would hide there first. Since it was a matter of life and death, the two of them were extraordinarily fast. Finally, they entered the cave before the eagles arrived. The cave was not big, but it was deep enough for the two of them to hide in. The eagles outside were too big to even stretch their beaks into the cave. There was a howling wind outside, mixed with the eagles' cry. The ground beneath their feet trembled. It was obvious that the eagles had landed on the peak. Then there was the sound of rocks rolling and the hissing of snakes. It was obvious that the golden snakes that did not hide well enough were forced to fight with the eagles. Ning Shuama hid at the entrance of the cave and stealthily looked outside. What she saw made her suck in a breath of cold air. These eagles knew how to use the freezing spell. They opened their mouths and spat out a gust of cold wind. It froze the snakes hiding in the crevices of the rocks, making them unable to move. Then they used their sharp beaks to peck at the crevices of the rocks. The hard rocks were instantly crushed into powder, and the golden snakes hidden inside were pulled out. The captured golden snakes were naturally unwilling to die like this. However, their bodies were stiff and they could not use the binding spell to strangle the eagles' necks. The eagles were not afraid of the poison they spat out, so they could only open their mouths and bite. These falcons were clearly experts at catching snakes. The place in their mouths was precisely the snake's 7 inches. When they saw the snake opening its mouth to bite over, they just shook their heads, and the snake drooped down like noodles and stopped moving. The eagles that caught the snake would flap their wings and fly up, meaning that they were on their way back. As most of the snakes hid in caves and crevices, It was not easy for the eagles to catch them. Those that were hidden shallowly were fished out by them in a few mouthfuls. However, those that were deeply hidden could not be reached. Thus, Ningxuama once again saw a rather strange scene. The eagles could actually destroy the caves. Their sharp beaks were sharper and harder than any iron tools, and they could dig out a large piece of rock with just one bite. They gradually widened the small holes to make it easier for them to enter. Ningxuama looked at the cave they were hiding in and was speechless. She did not expect these eagles to have the ability of woodpeckers. Woodpeckers use their beaks to break the bark of trees to catch insects. And these eagles use their beaks to break the stone walls to catch snakes. It was obviously not safe for them to hide in the cave. But if they ran out now, they would be live targets. One of the eagles seemed to have noticed that there were living creatures in the cave and strode over. Chapter 153. Oh no! Ningxuama retracted her head and walked deeper into the cave with number 2. Be careful. Number 2 pulled her back. She also felt that she had stepped on something slippery under her feet. She was startled and retreated backwards like flowing water. When she lowered her head to look, her body stiffened. Beneath their feet was a large snake. It was about 2 zhang long and as thick as a small bucket. Half of its body was coiled up, and its triangular head was raised high. Its pair of cold green eyes stared fixedly at Ningxuama and Qin Wentian. The cave was dark. Ningxuama's martial arts were still weak and her night vision was poor. At first, she couldn't see the inside of the cave clearly. Just now, she had almost stepped on the snake's tail. Ningxuama knew that this kind of snake had a bad temper, and its attack power was very strong. Ningxuama and number 2's body emitted a large amount of heat because of their running just now. At this moment, their body odor was different from the snake's. Logically speaking, this snake would explode and hurt people. However, they didn't expect that the snake would only use its pair of green eyes to look at them threateningly for a moment. Its body shrunk inwards and it closed its eyes again. The cave returned to darkness. A large bird's beak reached in from outside. A tongue stuck out from the beak and desperately swiped into the depths of the cave. Ningxuama and number 2 held their breath and tried their best to stick their bodies to the cave wall. Fortunately, the cave was deep enough and the bird's tongue couldn't reach them. However, looking at the bright red tongue not far in front of them, Ningxuama felt the hair on her back stand up. This bird's tongue could actually reach so deep. The birds in this world were all so mutated. The bird's tongue reached into the cave for a moment and then retracted back. Before Ningxuama could breathe a sigh of relief, the sound of the bird's beak pecking on the rocks came from outside. Amidst the rumbling, large rocks fell to the ground. The narrow cave entrance outside was also expanding at a speed visible to the naked eye. Oh no! It seemed that the bird had already discovered that there were snakes or other food in the cave. Ningxuama and number 2 had already retreated to the deepest part of the cave. At this speed, they would be swept out by the bird's beak in less than 15 minutes. They couldn't just sit and wait for death. Every now and then the bird would stick its tongue in and try a circle. Ningxuama quickly smeared different strong poisons on her and number 2's weapons. Taking advantage of the time when the bird's tongue came in to probe again, she leaped up and stabbed each of them once. Chi. The 2 swords pierced into the tongue, and blood splashed out. The bird let out a shrill cry and retracted its tongue at lightning speed. If the 2 of them had not withdrawn their swords quickly enough, they would have been dragged out by the tongue as well. From outside came the long cry of the falcon and the sound of its hooting. It was obvious that the falcon was in pain. After a while, the bird's chirping stopped, and the sound of crazily chiseling stones could be heard. It was obvious that the bird was angry. The speed at which he chiseled the stone was much faster than before. The poison didn't work. That's right, this bird eats poisonous things every day, so it has a strong resistance to poison. The plan of using poison to kill it has failed once again. Moreover, this bird had learned its lesson after suffering the first time. It no longer used its tongue to explore the cave, and only crazily expanded the cave entrance. A sound came from behind. Ningxuama and number 2 turned around and saw that the golden snake had opened its eyes again. It stuck out its long tongue at the 2 of them, and its large head was slowly approaching them. Ningxuama subconsciously retreated, and this time she retreated in the direction of the cave entrance. There was a huge beak waiting for them at the entrance. Chapter 154. Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. Was this snake trying to force them out and make them scapegoats? These birds would fly away as soon as they caught food. If they were forced out and became the bird's food, then the snake would be safe. How could a snake be so cunning? Since that was the case, Ning Xuema and number 2 glanced at each other. Then, one from the left and one from the right, they attacked the snake. This snake was ferocious and venomous. Once bitten by it, it would be over. Fortunately, when Ning Xuema came, she already knew the snake's temperament and taboo. She brought along many things that could restrain it. If it was under normal circumstances, number 2 would be able to deal with this huge snake. However, he had just been cured of the venom and did not have much strength left. He could not even use 20% of his strength. On the other hand, Ning Xuema was small and did not have much strength. Now that the two of them worked together, they could barely suppress the golden snake. The two of them spent a tremendous amount of effort before finally killing the snake. Then they worked together to push the snake's corpse outwards. The huge bird's beak came in and grabbed the snake's corpse before dragging it out. "We've finally escaped this calamity." Number 2 was still in shock as he let out a long sigh. Before he could finish his sentence, the sound of stone being chiseled could be heard again. Fuck, it can't be. With a scapegoat, why would it not let the two of them go? In the blink of an eye, the hole had been opened to a large enough size for the bird to drill its entire head in. Its huge beak was like lightning as it stabbed towards the two of them. At this moment, the two of them had nowhere to retreat. Ning Xuema was just outside the perimeter and the direction of the bird's beak was heading towards Ning Xuema's chest. Ning Xuema steeled her heart and wanted to use her sword to block it. However, unexpectedly, her shoulder tightened and she could not help but spin in a circle. The two of them had switched positions and number 2 was standing where she was just now. The bird's beak stabbed him and he was dragged outwards. "Miss Ning, take care." These were the last words that number 2 said to her. He wanted to use his own life to fight for Ning Xuema's survival. Ning Xuema's mind exploded. Seeing that number 2's body was about to be dragged out of the cave, she flew up and slashed her sword towards the huge beak. Sparks flew in all directions as Ning Xuema's dagger left a white mark on the bird's beak. The bird was in so much pain that it trembled. With a swoosh, the huge bird retreated from the cave. And because Ning Xuema couldn't withdraw her sword in time, she was brought out by it. Unfortunately, her clothes were hanging on the feathers near the bird's head. At this moment, his entire body was hanging on the bird's head, swinging back and forth. She hurriedly tried to cut off the straps of her clothes, but she didn't expect the bird to fly up into the sky as soon as it withdrew its head. Ning Xuema. She didn't dare to cut off her clothes anymore. On the contrary, she hurriedly wrapped the rest of her clothes around the bird's head. Her hands also tightly grasped the bird's feathers, afraid that she would fall and shatter into pieces. "Miss Ning." Number 2 was actually not dead yet. He was being held horizontally by the bird. Looking at Ning Xuema, his eyes were filled with tears. He didn't expect that this little girl would have the courage to live and die with him. He was too touched. Ning Xuema. She really didn't mean to cause this situation. "Don't move," she shouted in a low voice, stopping number 2's subconscious struggle. Looking at the bird, it didn't seem like it had any intention of killing him. Otherwise, it would have swallowed number 2 alive long ago. Even if he struggled to escape from the bird's beak, he would still be smashed into pieces. It was better to deal with the situation by remaining unchanged. Chapter 155. Number 2 had obviously thought of this as well, and did not dare to move again. Ning Xuema had sat on many flying devices before, but this was the first time she was flying on a bird's head. This bird had a person in its beak and a person on its head. It felt extremely uncomfortable and couldn't help but fly up and down, shaking its head constantly in an attempt to throw Ning Xuema off. High up in the sky, diving up and down, this feeling was 1,000 times more exciting and 10,000 times more dangerous than riding a roller coaster. Ning Xuema's stomach churned violently, and she felt like she was going to vomit. She held onto the bird's feathers tightly as her body was swung back and forth in the air. It was extremely dangerous. Compared to Ning Xuema, number 2 was much safer. He looked at Ning Xuema with trepidation and kept shouting for her to be careful. Ning Xuema also knew that this was extremely dangerous. Two of her belts had already been broken by this damn bird, leaving only one hanging dangerously. The main support points were still her hands. She took a deep breath and resisted the nausea from the sudden loss of gravity. She suddenly flipped her body upside down and finally climbed onto the bird's head, lying on top of it. Then she used both her hands and feet to firmly secure herself on top. Her small body was light, so lying on top of it like this finally made the bird feel less uncomfortable. It was also tired from the tossing and turning, so it simply flew towards the 9th summit of Heavenly Book Mountain. Although Ningshuama and Number 2's lives were not in danger for the time being, their prospects were not optimistic. The 9th summit was a mysterious place that legend said that only the sect masters of the various sects dared to venture into. Even if a rookie like her and Number 2, who was an amateur, could escape with their lives from the bird's mouth, could they escape the 9th summit alive? Miss Ning, this one has implicated you. Number 2's heart was filled with guilt. Stop talking nonsense and conserve your strength. Ningshuama did not hold back with him. This was not the time to be polite. It was most important to conserve her strength and seize every opportunity to survive. The speed of this eagle's flight was abnormally fast. The wind was biting cold, making it difficult for her to open her eyes. Riding on the bird's head at such a high altitude would inevitably make her dizzy, so she simply closed her eyes and secretly adjusted her breathing. Although the future was bleak, as long as there was a glimmer of hope, she had to live on. After flying like this for about half an hour, the eagle's flying speed slowed down. Ningshuama opened her eyes, only to see the mountains and rivers under her body moving backwards at a rapid speed. Countless tall trees flashed past her eyes. She looked in the direction where the bird was flying and saw a rugged black cliff in the distance. Needless to say, the cliff was the nest of the falcons. He absolutely could not allow it to bring them there, or else they would be completely dead. Her eyes searched desperately, trying to find a good place to rest. However, the bird had been flying very high, and there were only trees and rocks below. If she fell, she would be smashed to pieces no matter where she fell. Just as she was feeling a little hopeless, she suddenly heard the sound of a waterfall in the distance. Her eyes lit up. If there was a waterfall, there would be a pool. If they could pass by the pool, they might be saved. She tightened her body and used the dagger to cut off the last piece of cloth that was hanging on the feather. Then she used the cloth to blindfold one of the eagle's eyes. No matter what kind of bird it was, it would subconsciously fly in the direction it could see, and this eagle was no exception. Ningshuama used this method to adjust the direction of the eagle's flight, and drove it in the direction of the sound of water. The sound of water was getting louder and louder, and not far ahead a lake appeared. The lake was not small, and the lake water was dark blue. It was obvious that the lake was very deep. Sure enough, the heavens did not want her to die. Be careful. Get ready to escape. Ningshuama gave the order to Number 2. Number 2's body immediately tensed up. Ningshuama waited until the eagle under her was about to reach the lake. She suddenly grabbed the feather and swung her dagger towards one of the eagle's eyes. Chapter 156. No matter how tough a bird was, its eyes were its weakest spot. Blood splattered everywhere, and the bird cried out in pain. Number 2 fell from its beak and fell into the lake like a meteor. Ningshuama didn't hesitate either. After she succeeded, she immediately jumped down from the bird's head and swooped down. There were 2 loud bangs, and 2 huge waves splashed on the surface of the lake. The 2 of them fell heavily into the lake. Although the hawk flew a little lower under Ningshuama's control, it was still about 100 meters high. Falling from such a high place, even if they fell into the water, the impact would still be fatal. Although Ningshuama adjusted herself in the air to the diving position of a diver, she still felt dizzy when she fell into the water. She couldn't help but fall to the bottom of the lake. Fortunately, the bottom of the lake was deep enough. Ningshuama couldn't see the bottom even after diving for more than 10 meters. When she finally got rid of the dizziness and struggled to float to the surface, it was already half a minute later. She had just floated to the surface and didn't have time to take a breath. Suddenly, a strong wind blew above her head. A shadow covered her head, and a pair of sharp claws scratched at her head. "Shuema!" She heard a loud shout. A figure pounced on her and pressed her into the water. Splash! The pressure on Ningshuama's head was suddenly relieved. She raised her head and saw number two's body being lifted into the air by a huge bird's claw. Number two. Ning Shuima popped her head out of the water and shouted. But she could only watch as he was carried into the sky. My name is Stone. Shuima. I'm happy to have met you in this life. It's worth dying. In my next life I only want to be your bodyguard. Number two's waist had already been scratched by the hawk's claws. His internal organs had been ruptured. He knew that he had no chance of survival this time. Rather than being brought back to the nest and eaten by the bird, it was better to kill himself. This would also cut off Ning Shuima's idea of rescuing him. Therefore, he forced himself to finish his words. The sword in his hand that he had been holding tightly pressed against his neck. Blood spurted out, and his life was cut off. Blood trickled down from the sky like a small stream, falling into the water and stirring up circles of ripples as it flowed into the distance. A few drops of blood dripped onto Ning Shuima's face, which was still warm. She touched it and watched the blood drop from her fingertips. She closed her eyes slightly. She knew that he was dead. In the end, she didn't save him. Instead, he saved her twice. He was her first companion who had gone through life and death with her in this world. She didn't expect him to die here. She didn't even know the real name of number two, who had a baby face and was always sullen. She knew that in order to train a group of personal bodyguards, some princes would have a special training camp. The children in the training camp were all abducted from a young age. They didn't know where they came from. They didn't know where they came from. They didn't even know their own names. Their daily task was to learn, and kill. After rounds of cruel elimination, most of the children died in the process. The most outstanding ones survived and became the bodyguards of the princes. Their only purpose in life was to loyally protect their masters. They were the sharpest sword in the hands of the princes, the strongest shield. They didn't have names, only code names. Number two was undoubtedly the most outstanding of them all. Chapter 157. Number two was undoubtedly one of the most outstanding. He barely remembered his own nickname, but he had never told anyone about it. This time he finally said it to the girl he trusted the most. The falcon was already far away, but there were still bloodstains on the surface of the lake, rippling in circles. Ning Shuima soaked in the lake and looked at the falcon's back as it disappeared into the distance. She slowly clenched her fists. If she was just a bit stronger, her companions might not have died. She did not want this kind of situation to happen again, so she had to become stronger. She had to survive. The ninth summit was the most dangerous place in the legends. It was not a place where a rookie like her could stay for long, so her main goal now was to leave this place safely. She quickly looked around and saw that there were mountains all around her, surrounding the lake in the middle. The terrain was similar to the Heaven Lake in Changbai Mountain. Could this lake be the crater of a volcano? Looking at the peaks around her, her eyebrows rose even higher. There were a total of 8 peaks around her, and each peak faintly corresponded with the 8 trigrams. The 8 peaks all had different shapes. Some were like dragons, some were like tigers, some were like phoenixes, and some were like turtles and snakes in one body. Ning Shuima's heart skipped a beat. Wasn't this the azure dragon on the left, the white tiger on the right, the vermilion bird on the front, and the black tortoise on the back? These 4 mountains were located in the east, west, south, and north respectively. The other 4 peaks were obviously much shorter, and their shapes were not very regular. They also looked like some animals, but Ning Shuima could not tell what they looked like. The 8 peaks also had different colors. Some were sparkling like snow, some were fiery red like the morning sun, some were dark green like jade, and some were dark like the night. Each had its own style. On each peak, there was a waterfall flowing down. The color of the waterfall was the same as the color of the peak. The waterfall flowed all the way into the lake. This scene was like a dream. Even in a dream, one would not be able to imagine such a magnificent scene. More importantly, this kind of combination of peaks was the easiest to gather the spiritual chi of heaven and earth. In addition, the other 16 peaks of the Heavenly Book Mountain seemed to be worshipping it. Their spiritual chi would also gather towards the 9th summit, so it was not strange for the highest level of magical beasts to appear here. This was a natural holy land for cultivation. If he could cultivate here, he would be able to achieve 100 with half the effort, and his cultivation speed would be astonishing. Was this a masterpiece of nature? Or was it the work of the gods? If it was naturally formed, then it would be too much of a coincidence. If it was man-made, who had the power to move mountains and fill seas? Unless they were immortals. Thinking of immortals, Ning Shuama thought of Di Zun. Could it be him? He shook his head again. Impossible. If that person really had such an ability, he definitely wouldn't have stayed on this continent. Instead, he would have ascended to the heavenly court to become an immortal. Perhaps it was really natural, a masterpiece left behind by God in this world. The most beautiful place was also the most dangerous place. Ning Shuama was not in the mood to enjoy the beautiful scenery. She had to leave the lake first, climb up a mountain and then find a way down. She was floating in the middle of the lake. She looked at the mountains around her. Since this place coincided with the 8 trigrams, she decided to try the gate of life. She chose a direction and swam towards the shore. At this time it was already night time. It was exactly the 15th night. The moon in the sky was as big as a silver plate, reflecting the lake's sparkling waves, as if the lake was filled with pearls. The moonlight was as light as a thin veil, gently rippling along with the lake. Chapter 158. Ning Shuama felt as if there was a weak electric current in the lake. While she was swimming, she could feel the electric current flowing into her body. The feeling was similar to when she was in the hot spring in the Crown Prince's residence. In fact, the feeling was much stronger. Was this lake the place where the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was refined and mysterious? Therefore, the heaven and earth spiritual energy was the most majestic. Even a trash like her could feel it so strongly. If a genius were to come here, 3 days of cultivation here would be equivalent to 3 years of cultivation elsewhere. Strange, such a treasure mountain. Even if only the sovereign could come here, they should have thought of ways to take over this place and build a cave residence or something, right? At the very least, they should have come here once every few days. It was not like what Ji Yunhuang said, that the sovereigns did not come here often. They might not even come here once in 8 to 10 years. This was a little illogical. Ning Shuama actually wanted to soak in this lake for a while longer. Maybe if she were to soak in this lake for 10 days to half a month, she would be able to become a pillar of the sect. However, she had not eaten anything for almost half a day and had risked her life for so long. She was so hungry that her heart was stuck to her back. She was anxious to find a place to rest and eat something to replenish her energy. The bright moon in the sky was like a plate. In her hungry stomach, it looked like a large sesame seed cake. She could not wait to take 2 bites out of it. She swam for a while and suddenly felt that something was wrong. With her swimming speed, she should be close to the shore. However, when she looked forward, she was still so far away from the shore. It was as if she was going in circles. Strange, no matter which direction she looked at, it was clear and picturesque. She could even see the shapes of the plants by the lakeside clearly. When she swam, she could clearly see the water traces in front of her, but she could not swim to the shore. It was as if she had encountered a ghost wall. Ning Shuama had walked the path at night many times. She had also walked in the deep mountains and forests. She had even ambushed at the mass grave. She had also encountered a ghost wall before. However, the ghost wall was surrounded by fog and she could not see the path. It was not like the current situation where she could see everything clearly. To be on the safe side, she cut her finger and used her blood to draw a simple spell to break the ghost labyrinth. She had learned this method from an exorcist. Although she had only learned it once, it was effective in breaking the ghost labyrinth. But now she had used her most powerful method, but it didn't work. She was still in the middle of the water. There was something strange about this lake. Could it be that he was heading in the wrong direction? She tried to swim in a different direction. She chose to swim in the opposite direction. Unexpectedly, after swimming for less than a meter, the lake water, which had been as calm as a mirror, suddenly started to boil. It formed a huge whirlpool in front of and behind her, and the waves were trying to pull her into the whirlpool. Damn it, the lake was so deep. If she really got sucked in, she would be done for. She hurriedly struggled to get away from the vortex. She was an excellent swimmer. Even in such a turbulent current, she could rely on her own strength to break free from the whirlpool's whirlpool and stay away from it. However, it was strange. As long as she swam forward, there would definitely be a huge whirlpool in front of her. Moreover, the whirlpools were bigger and stronger than the previous one. There were a few times when she almost got sucked in. When she looked back, the place where the whirlpool had appeared was calm. The whirlpool had disappeared without a trace. It was no different from before. Chapter 159. Ningxuama didn't dare to take any more risks, so she turned around and swam back. The moment she swam back, the turbulent water around her immediately became gentle again. The blue waves were boundless, and the water was as clear as a mirror. She was speechless. Was it an illusion? But she clearly felt the huge pulling force of the whirlpool. It didn't seem to be an illusion. She tried to swim in other directions, but every time she encountered all kinds of dangers. For example, Xiang Nan encountered a huge magical beast that looked like a legendary water monster. It jumped straight up from the water, and she almost swam into its big mouth. At first, she told herself that it was an illusion and she didn't need to pay attention to it. But when the water monster's tail hit her waist almost broke. Only then did she believe it was real. Fortunately, she was smart enough to only be hit by the monster's tail. Otherwise, she probably would have been cut into 2 pieces. She saw that the situation wasn't good, so she had to turn back. Only then did the monster disappear. She didn't have any luck in other directions either. In some places, an erupting volcano appeared in front of her, and the red magma came crashing down. If she hadn't dodged quickly, she probably would have been burned to a crisp. In some places it was like a muddy quagmire. Even a goose feather couldn't float. Ningxuama believed that once she fell into it, she would never be able to get out of it. She tried all 8 directions. Except for the life gate that she chose at the beginning, the other directions were all dead ends. Ningxuama looked at the shore in front of her. It wasn't far, but she couldn't swim to the shore. Her heart turned cold. Could it be that she was destined to drown in this strange lake? Suddenly, a bird's cry came from the sky. Ningxuama looked up and saw a big bird with a human head and an eagle's body flying straight toward her. Obviously, it wanted to catch her and use her as food. Ningxuama originally wanted to submerge herself into the water to avoid it, but an idea came to her mind. She slightly twisted her body and waited for the big bird's claw to grab her. The ribbon in her hand flew out and wrapped around the big bird's claw, abruptly tightening. The big bird was shocked. Ningxuama had already used the force of the pull to fly up and grab onto one of the big bird's legs. The big bird soared into the air. It was obviously a clever one, and it immediately used its other claw to scratch. However, in this kind of life and death situation, Ningxuama's body was exceptionally slippery. Furthermore, its thigh was thick, which acted as a shield for her. It didn't manage to scratch her. Instead, it scratched its own thigh until it was dripping with blood. The big bird scratched a few times in succession, but to no avail. He lowered his head and spat fire at her, but she dodged quickly. Not only did the fire not touch her, but she also burned the hair on her legs. This time the big bird had no more curses. It had to give up the idea of getting Ningxuama down for the time being. It flapped its wings and flew back to its nest. This was also Ningxuama's goal. As long as it took her away from this strange lake, she would think of other ways to escape. Unexpectedly, the big bird seemed to have encountered a ghost in the air. It was obviously flying forward, but below it was the lake. It couldn't fly out of the range of the lake. After flying for a while, the bird seemed to have panicked. It started to fly around like a headless fly. Ningxuama hugged its thigh and looked around. The scenery didn't change, but the big bird seemed to have encountered something that terrified it to the extreme. Its body started to tremble, and it started to struggle violently. On its wings, body, and claws there were wounds. Those wounds were of different shapes. Chapter 160. There were wounds on its wings, body, and claws. The wounds were of different shapes. Some looked like they had been torn apart, some looked like they had been injured by a sharp weapon, and some looked like they had been pecked by something. Ningxuama was shocked. It seemed that the bird had been attacked by the illusion just like she had been in the water. Moreover, it was a real attack. A cold wind suddenly blew toward Ningxuama. The wind was fierce and had a strange fishy smell. Ningxuama reacted quickly. Once she realized that something was wrong, she immediately let go of her hands and fell into the lake again. Almost at the same time, the bird let out a miserable cry. Its 2 legs had been cut off by something. It lost its balance and fell into the lake. This bird was obviously a non-swimmer. It flopped in the lake a few times and slowly sank to the bottom. The lake returned to its previous calm. The lake rippled gently as if nothing had happened. Ningxuama had goosebumps all over her body. It seemed that not only was there something strange in the lake, but there was also something strange in the sky above the lake. Looking at this large body of water, it didn't seem like there were any traps. Could it be the legendary divine restriction? She couldn't be so unlucky, right? She looked around blankly in the water, feeling as if there was no road to heaven and no door to hell. If she had known this would happen, she would have agreed to the old emperor's proposal and become his beast concubine. It would have been better than suffering in this place. This dispirited thought only flashed through her mind. She clenched her teeth and pulled herself together. Her personality was not to give up easily until the last moment. Other people wouldn't give up until they reached the Yellow River, but she wouldn't give up until she reached the Yellow River. Unless she took her last breath, she would crash her way out even if she had to. She didn't believe that this was a hopeless situation without a chance of survival. Perhaps the chance of survival was not far away. She would be able to see it if she tried harder. She took a deep breath. Since it was useless no matter where she swam, she might as well float on the spot and recover her strength. The surrounding water rippled slightly, and countless weak electric currents flowed into her body from the major acupoints all over her body. This electric current was different from the internal energy that she cultivated. Wherever it went, it was as if there were green vines wriggling around, blooming brightly all the way. It made her feel as if her entire body had become a few kilograms lighter. When the electric current once again approached her dantian, it paused for a moment before disappearing without a trace. Ningxuama. Other people's dantian was used to store psychokinesis, but her dantian seemed to be used to devour psychokinesis. As long as she cultivated a little bit of psychokinesis, as long as she passed by this place, it would immediately be devoured clean. Could it be that there was a monster in her dantian that ate psychokinesis? Ningxuama tried her best to use her inner vision to see the situation in her dantian, but all she could see was a vast expanse of white fog. What the hell? Ningxuama knew what other people would see when they used their inner vision to look at their dantian. As long as they cultivated psychokinesis, they would be able to see their own crystal pillar-like spiritual roots. The higher the spiritual roots, the stronger the psychokinesis. However, she couldn't even see a single spiritual leaf, let alone a spiritual root. After being tormented for so long, she was even hungrier and her stomach was burning. She raised her head and suddenly saw that the huge bird that had sunk earlier had floated up again. It was half floating and half sinking not far away from her. She swam over and took out her dagger. Chapter 161. This bird did not have copper skin and iron bones, but its meat was very easy to cut. She easily cut off 2 pieces and stuffed one into her mouth, ignoring the smell. This bird was ugly and its meat was quite tough, so it was more strenuous to chew than chewing cowhide. Ningxuama straightened her neck and swallowed 2 pieces, then couldn't eat anymore. That's right, according to number 2. All the magical beasts here had crystals in their bodies. This bird was produced by the 9 peaks, so it must have reached the 8th level of psychokinesis. There might be a top-grade crystal in its body. If she could survive and bring the crystal back, it would be a very cool thing to do. And it would not be a waste of her trip here. She immediately began to dissect the big bird. Fortunately, she had seen the process of number 2 retrieving the crystal, so she knew where the crystals were usually hidden. So after half an hour, she finally took out a transparent red crystal that looked like a deer's antler from the strange bird's sternum. This crystal was less than a foot long, and its diameter was less than an inch. It looked very small and delicate. Ningxuama turned the crystal over and over to examine it. This crystal should not be as good as the one inside the flying dragon centipede's body, right? It seemed that the crystals produced by the 9 peaks were not as good as the crystals produced by the 6th and 7th peaks. She held the crystal and wanted to feel the spiritual power on it, but she did not expect that as soon as she tried to use her spiritual power, she felt a stream of energy from the crystal enter her palm. Her entire arm felt as if it was electrified, and immediately went numb. This numbness spread very quickly, and in the blink of an eye, it spread throughout her body. She felt as if she had turned into a hard wooden stake in an instant. She wanted to throw away the crystal in her hand, but she couldn't. She could only feel the hot stream of energy crazily flowing through her body, and in the blink of an eye, it had also reached her dantian. Then just like before, it disappeared in the blink of an eye without even a spark. At the same time that the stream of energy disappeared, Ning Xuema also regained consciousness. She opened her eyes and found that she had sunk more than 2 meters into the water like an iron dummy. She quickly moved her limbs and floated up again. Strangely, although the hot stream of energy that the red crystal brought to her was uncomfortable, after the stream of energy disappeared, she actually felt comfortable again. The internal energy in her dantian had an obvious trend of growth. Looking at the red crystal in the water again, she was shocked. The red crystal that was as red as the morning sun had now turned into a gray-white bone. It was as if all the nourishment and spiritual energy had been sucked clean by her. This scene was a bit strange. Ning Xuema threw away the bone and looked at her hand. Her hands were flushed red, and her fingers were long and slender. She seemed to be a lot more moisturized than before. The calluses on his palms had also faded to the point where they were almost invisible. Ning Xuema was stunned for a moment. Could it be that this hand of hers had the legendary star-sucking great technique? She shook her head. She didn't want to think about these minor issues anymore. She had to find a way out first. He had to find a way out first. She carefully looked around and suddenly realized that her eyesight seemed to have improved. Previously, she could only vaguely see the branches of the big trees by the shore. Now she could actually see the direction of the top leaves. Since there was a restriction above the lake, it proved that the restriction wasn't placed in the lake, but in the surroundings. Ning Xuema's gaze landed on the surrounding mountain peaks again. Suddenly, she realized that the 4 mountains that resembled divine beasts seemed to have changed a little. Strange, the mountains could also move. She stared at the 8 mountains for a long time and finally realized that the 8 mountains and the lake in the middle were actually moving slowly. Chapter 162. Along with their rotation, their shapes were also changing. The white tiger's body was gradually elongating and had the tendency to turn into an azure dragon. Her heart suddenly moved. Could this be a 9-star 8 trigrams array? The more she looked at it, the more it looked like it and the more surprised she was. She had seen the 9-star 8 trigrams array in a book before. It had an unpredictable mechanism. If she had the materials, she could also set it up. However, this kind of array was set up with stones and trees. It would also be set up on a large turntable to correspond to the 9 planets in the sky. Because the conditions for setting up this kind of array were too harsh, Ning Xuema only knew how to set it up on paper. She had never set it up before. She did not expect to see it here. Moreover, it was set up with mountain peaks. Making the surrounding mountains rotate was simply unimaginable. The things in this world really couldn't be judged with common sense. Ning Xuema sighed in her heart. Since she had already seen through the array, she naturally knew how to break it. She followed the method of breaking the array in the water. She swam 1 meter forward, half a meter backward, 1 foot diagonally, and 3 feet horizontally. She kept changing her direction in the water and sure enough, the illusion she saw before did not appear again. 2 hours later, her eyes suddenly lit up. The scenery around her had completely changed. The lake was still the same lake. There was no change, but the scenery around the lake was completely different. The original Divine Beast Mountain had disappeared without a trace, and was replaced by a mountain peak that pierced through the clouds. It was like a graceful beauty standing tall in all directions. The entire mountain peak was covered with ice and snow. Under the moonlight, it was crystal clear white. On the 2 sides of the mountain peak, there were 2 waterfalls that flowed down like pearls and splashed jade all the way into the lake. On the 2 sides of the mountain peak, there were small mountains that looked like children under the seat of a fairy. Between the mountain peaks, there were wisps of white clouds. The clouds covered the sky, making it look like a dream. At a glance, it was as if a high and mighty fairy was leading a group of fairy children on a tour of the world. Ning Xuema stared at the highest mountain peak. The mountain peak was completely white without a trace of other colors. She vaguely felt that this mountain seemed familiar, as if she had seen it somewhere before. After staring at it for a long time, he suddenly realized that this mountain didn't look like a beauty, but rather like the ancestor. The mountains were like his oversized white robe, and the glaciers that hung from the peaks were like his long hair. The ancestor's hair was as black as ink, but if this mountain had hair, it was as white as snow. Apart from this difference, the mountain's topography was very similar to that of the venerable emperor. Could it be that the ancestor had dressed himself up in imitation of this peak? Yes, that's possible. Super awesome people usually have super awesome ways to act cool. At this time, she had already climbed up to the shore. The green grass on the shore was like a carpet. Sitting on it was like sitting on a soft sofa. Very comfortable. Tired, she was really tired. She was so tired that all the bones in her body felt like they were about to fall apart. She didn't dare to lie down, afraid that she wouldn't be able to get up again once she lay down. Because there was no one to protect her and she was in such a dangerous place, she didn't dare to enter a meditative state. She just closed her eyes and panted. Her divine sense was still constantly paying attention to the movements around her. Suddenly, she seemed to notice something. She suddenly opened her eyes and turned her head to look at the lake behind her. Then, she froze there. Chapter 163. There was a strange platform in the middle of the lake that was empty just a moment ago. The platform was stacked on top of each other, as if it was formed by pieces of green leaves. It was the size of a square table, and it shone under the moonlight. However, this was not what shocked Ningxuama the most. What stunned her the most was that there was a child sitting on the platform. It was a child that looked like it was carved out of fine jade. The child looked to be about 2 years old. He had slightly closed eyes, a tall nose, light pink lips, and a cinnabar mole that looked like a flower bud between his eyebrows. He was only wearing a light silver doo-doo, revealing his fair arms and legs. He was meditating with his eyes closed. His snow-white hair was draped over his body like a curtain, and it shone with a silver luster under the moonlight. The platform was in the middle of the lake, and the moonlight shone on him. The surroundings were hazy like a veil. In the half-lit landscape, only his figure was so distinct. The moonlight generously created a circle of faint silver light around him, as if he was enveloped in a layer of Buddha's light. Immortal? Monster? Or a mountain elf? Ningxuama stared at the child, and a few guesses flashed through her mind. Naturally, she did not think that he was human. After all, this was the 9th peak that normal people could not enter. No child would come here by accident. She held her breath, and her eyes fell on the cinnabar mole between his eyebrows. The shape of the cinnabar mole looked a little like a ginseng flower. Could this be a ginseng baby? Ningxuama's eyes lit up. She looked at his fair arms and legs, and the image of a fat ginseng flashed past her eyes. Ginseng was a great tonic. It was said that ginseng would take a human form after 100 years, a head and a face after 500 years, and all 5 senses after 1,000 years. It could only transform into a human form after 10,000 years. Usually it would be in the shape of a baby. There were countless legends about ginseng babies among the people, but the most famous one was that one could live forever after eating one. In the legends, Zhang Guolao became an immortal after eating a ginseng spirit. This place was deserted, and the lake was so strange that no one would be able to come here in 10,000 years. It was not impossible for a ginseng to cultivate into a human form. She didn't expect to bump into one when she came here by accident. How lucky! Since she had encountered him, she would not let him go. Maybe if she ate this ginseng baby, her power would increase greatly and she would become a genius beauty. She would be able to do whatever she wanted on this continent. More importantly, after her cultivation had greatly increased, she was more confident that she could break out of this mountain peak. She secretly took a deep breath and looked at the things she had brought with her. She needed silver needles and red threads to catch the ginseng essence. There were silver needles and silk threads, but unfortunately they were not red. However, this was not a problem for her. She gently cut her finger with a short knife and dyed the thread red with blood. Then he put it into a small sealed bottle. When everything was ready, she slipped into the water again. She was an excellent swimmer. She could swim underwater for 3 minutes without needing to breathe. She swam underwater like a silent barracuda and moved towards the platform, nearer still. The distance was about 500 meters. Ningxuama only took 2 breaths along the way. In between breaths, she glanced at the boy again. The boy was still meditating. oblivious to the approaching danger. When she was close to the green platform, Ning Xuema slowed down. She first gathered her strength in the water and held the silver needles in her hand. Chapter 164. Legend had it that one had to prick the ginseng baby to seal it so that it could not run away. Head, neck, chest, legs, feet? She had read too few myths, so she could not remember. She approached from the back of the boy and looked at him from the surface of the water. She saw that the skin of the boy's back was like a beautiful jade carving under the moonlight, without a single flaw. His silvery hair flowed into the water, as smooth as the moonlight. Such a posture of the boy's back was extremely beautiful. If she were to prick him with the needle, Ning Xuema suddenly felt that she could not do it. Forget it. According to the legend, it was wrapped with a red thread. She might as well prick the boy's undergarment with the silver needle, and wrap the thread around his neck. In this case, she could only go around to the front of the boy. She silently dived into the water again and inevitably saw the roots of the green leaf platform. Her heart skipped a beat. The bottom of the green leaf platform was like a big tree. There was a huge root system with countless aerial roots crisscrossing in the water. These fine aerial roots were hollow, allowing fine streams of water to flow into them. Ning Xuema could clearly see the gurgling sound of the water flowing inside the aerial roots. The direction of the flow was precisely the direction where the boy was sitting cross-legged. Could it be that the boy was not only absorbing the essence of the moon, but also absorbing the spiritual energy in the lake? This was a good idea. The spiritual energy here was the richest. If one cultivated well, cultivating here for a year would be equivalent to cultivating elsewhere for 100 years. No wonder the ginseng baby was so fresh and beautiful. Even if you cultivate into a demon, you will still be my food today. She was like a snake hunting its prey, quietly swimming to the front of the boy and slowly approaching him. Then she suddenly launched an attack. The silver needle in her hand was like a ray of light, with a red thread running directly towards the boy's undergarment. Fast, accurate, and ruthless. Only these three words could be compared to Ning Xuema's attack. The boy was obviously not prepared. Before he even opened his eyes, the silver needle had already pierced into his undergarment. What Ning Xuema did not expect was that the moment the silver needle touched the boy's undergarment, it was as if it had touched a mill. It instantly shattered and disappeared without a trace. At the crucial moment, the red thread was still powerful. It did not stop and continued to wrap around the boy's body. There was a way. Ning Xuema's movements were extremely fast. When the red thread wrapped around the boy's body, she suddenly jumped out of the water and pounced on the boy like a hungry tiger hunting for its prey. With a plop sound, Ning Xuema landed on the green leaf platform, but there was nothing in her arms. She hurriedly opened her eyes and found that the boy who was originally sitting on the green platform had disappeared. When she pounced down, her arms were clearly about to hug the boy's body. Unexpectedly, when he closed his arms, he only hugged a ball of air. It disappeared just like that. Her red string was clearly wrapped around him. Ning Xuema hurriedly looked at the red thread. One end of the red thread was tied to her little finger, and the other end was wrapped around the ginseng baby. At this moment, the red thread on her finger was still fine, but the other end was submerged in the water. The ginseng baby fell into the water. As expected of someone who had cultivated into a demon. How vigilant! Ning Xuema jumped up and was about to jump into the water. She was not on guard against the platform that was formed by the green leaves. The green leaves suddenly expanded and flew over. Very obviously, the platform wanted to wrap her up like dumpling filling. Needless to say, this was the work of the ginseng baby. Ning Xuema tapped her toes on the platform and leaped up. When the green leaves were about to wrap around her, she flew out. Chapter 165. Her movements could not be described as slow, but the green leaves grew even faster, comparable to lightning. Just as her body was about to break free from the encirclement of the green leaves suddenly grew another 2 feet in the air, and suddenly closed in. Ning Xuema's head was covered in dense green. Her head slammed into the leaves. The leaves were obviously soft, but when she bumped into them, she felt a burning pain. Her body fell from above and landed on the green platform below. At this moment, the green leaves around her had completely closed. She felt like she was trapped in a ball of green leaves, like a flower bud wrapped in layers of leaves. She naturally was not willing to be trapped like this. She struggled left and right inside. But these green leaves looked tender, as if they would break with a poke, but in fact they were more flexible than cowhide. No matter if she punched them or cut them with a knife, it was useless. She simply could not open the slightest gap, unable to break free. Not only that, after the green leaves wrapped around her, they began to shrink, squeezing her from all directions. Ning Xuema was wrapped inside. The space was getting smaller and smaller, and gradually she almost could not breathe. She desperately tried to find a way to break out of the encirclement, and did not see the boy standing not far away on the water. The water gently rippled, his silver hair like satin fluttering in the wind. His pair of deep blue eyes like the waves of the sea fell on the green flower bud that wrapped around Ning Xuema. A trace of astonishment flashed across his eyes. Someone could break in here. How is that possible? The red thread that Ning Xuema threw out was originally wrapped around his waist, but now it was hooked around his little finger as white as jade. His long eyelashes drooped down, as if he was sensing something. A moment later, he opened his eyes. The astonishment in his eyes deepened. The little girl who broke in here is actually a psychokinesis trash. A trash can break in here, simply defying the natural order. Even rarer than the 8 wonders of the world. If he met such a rare person, he could let her go. Perhaps he could keep her by his side to study, or teach her some martial arts so that her miracle could reach a higher level. But this place does not allow any outsiders to enter, and does not allow outsiders to know. No one can be an exception. So, the boy pursed his thin lips and a faint light flashed across his eyes. His fingers slowly tightened. Following his movements, the green flower bud began to close even faster. Ning Xuema, who was inside, naturally sensed that the green leaves around her were closing faster and faster. At this rate, she would be squeezed into a pile of fertilizer by these green walls in less than a minute. It seemed that the ginseng baby wasn't easy to deal with. She couldn't bear to stab him, but he could bear to squeeze her. Ning Xuema could not help but tug at the red thread between her fingers. This thread was the legendary heavenly silkworm silk, and it was given to her by Ji Yunhuang. She had always kept it on her body like a treasure. Its flexibility was the best in the world, and it was a good treasure for her to escape in times of danger. This time he had spent a lot of effort to tie up this ginseng baby. He knew that ordinary threads were probably useless against this ginseng baby. The red thread became taut as she hooked it. It was obvious that there was still something tied to the other end. The doll had not escaped yet. Is he still in the water? If she could pull him over and restrain him, perhaps she could escape from this damn green ball. Ning Xuema secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Her internal force poured into the thin red thread, and she suddenly pulled. She let out a low cry. Chapter 166. The other end of the red thread felt like it was tied to a mountain. She did not manage to pull the other party over. Instead, she staggered and her little finger hurt. The thin red thread pierced into her palm, creating a bloody groove. Blood began to drip down like pearls. The boy outside was still hooking his finger on the red thread. Ning Xuema's pull only made him frown slightly. He sensed her strength and his eyes fell on the green ball again. He seemed to be able to see the person inside through the layers of green leaves. Inside, Ning Xuema suddenly had an illusion. She felt a pair of ice-cold eyes sizing her up. This feeling was so clear that it made her body stiffen instantly. Dizun. Dizun came. No, Dizun was still pretending to be an ice sculpture in the palace of Chongkong country. It was said that he had to stay for 3 days. It had only been 2 days. He should still be meditating there. How could he come here? Illusion, it must be an illusion. At this moment, her blood finally dripped on the green leaf under her feet. This green leaf was strange. When the blood fell on it, it did not seep out. Instead, it rolled like a pearl. The green leaf suddenly trembled as if it was disgusted by the blood. It shook with all its might, trying to shake the blood out. It did not close up quickly. This green leaf was afraid of her blood. Ning Xuema finally saw a glimmer of hope to survive. She cut her hand with a short knife. In order to make the cut more effective, she made a deep cut. Blood gushed out like a spring and flowed like a stream. Her body spun like a top and she wiped the surrounding walls with her blood-stained hand. The entangled green leaves avoided her. Soon, the green ball was forced to disperse by her blood-stained hand. She finally saw the starry sky again. Almost at the same time, Ning Xuema flew up. At her judgment of the direction was very accurate. She directly pounced on the boy standing in the rippling water. "Little ginseng child, let's see where you can run to this time." The moment she escaped, the boy's fingers seemed to be about to form a spell. When he heard her words, he was slightly stunned. At the moment he was stunned, Ning Xuema had already pounced on him. Her movements were as fast as lightning. The boy couldn't dodge in time and was pounced on by her. Splash! The two hugged each other and rolled into the water, creating a huge splash. The baby's skin was smooth and soft like milk chocolate. Ning Xuema was very good at hugging people. Her right arm hugged his upper body, and even his two little arms were wrapped tightly around it. Her left arm held his two calves so that he couldn't move his limbs. The big one and the small one are rolling in the water, and they can't stop for a while. Ning Xuema tries to balance herself with her legs. She hugged him like this. Her face was very close to his little face and their eyes met. The little baby's watery blue eyes were like an intoxicating sea. They were as calm as a frozen lake, but they were also rippling with waves. Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. Since she was sure that the other party was a ginseng baby, she wanted to take a bite out of it the moment she hugged it. But looking at such a pair of eyes, she couldn't bite it. Her lips rubbed against his face. His face was so tender that it seemed like water could come out with a pinch. When her lips touched it, it was like touching a piece of warm jade. The baby was probably not used to being so close to people, so he struggled in her arms and tilted his head back slightly, trying to avoid her lips. Chapter 167. This little thing still wanted to escape? He still wanted to avoid her? Not a chance. Although Ning Xuema couldn't bring herself to bite him, she didn't mind kissing him. She didn't hold back either. She tightened her arms, lowered her head, and pecked him on his pink lips, so tender. So tender. His little lips were like soft tofu or jelly, as if they would melt in her mouth. There was also an indescribable fragrance. Ning Xuema had interacted with many people in her previous life, but she had never really interacted with babies. She wanted to give him a kiss to show off her sovereignty, but when she held his soft lips in her mouth, she couldn't help but want to take a bite. However, if she took a bite, she would bite off such beautiful lips. Such a beautiful baby wouldn't look good without a mouth. She suddenly felt guilty for destroying a work of art. However, she was really hungry. She caught this ginseng baby to satisfy her appetite. Should she bite him or not? Ning Xuema hesitated for a moment with the baby's mouth in her mouth. The baby in her arms probably felt that she had bad intentions. A cold light flashed in his eyes, and his little hands that were trapped in her arms started to form a spell. However, how smart was Ning Xuema? Since she thought that he was a ginseng baby, she would naturally be on guard against him using any immortal spells. She was especially careful with his little hands. Therefore, when his fingers moved, before he could form any spell, his fingers suddenly tightened. Ning Xuema's arms wrapped around his body and grabbed his little hands. Ning Xuema's hands weren't big. They could even be said to be small and delicate. However, compared to this baby's little hands, it was very intimidating. Her hands completely covered his little hands. The baby couldn't form any spells anymore. The baby's eyes flashed. Ning Xuema was still hesitating whether she should bite off his little mouth. Suddenly, she felt a cold sensation between her lips and teeth. His little tongue directly entered her mouth. Ning Xuema was shocked. She instinctively moved her head back and finally let go of his little mouth. She stared at the baby in her arms. He knew how to French kiss at such a young age. He didn't learn well. No, this little kid definitely didn't want to kiss her with his tongue. Instead, he wanted to use his tongue to cast some kind of spell in her mouth. Earlier, when his little tongue touched her tongue, it caused her tongue to go numb for a moment. If she hadn't reacted quickly, her entire mouth would have gone numb, and she might have even choked on a few mouthfuls of water. This little ginseng spirit seemed to be very unwilling to be captured. He tried every possible way to break free from her, but unfortunately, she didn't fall for his tricks. Ning Xuema held his hand even tighter. She couldn't avoid touching the red thread on his finger. If it was an ordinary silk thread, It would melt and return to its original color after soaking it in water for a moment. However, this sky silk thread was different. If it was not washed with a special method after being soaked in blood, the blood would always adhere to it, and it would be bright as if it had just been dripped on. His small hand was as white as a lotus root, and the red thread on it was exceptionally conspicuous. Ning Xuema's heart skipped a beat. She remembered that her red thread was wrapped around his waist, but for some reason it was now wrapped around his fingers. Could it be that the red string that tied the ginseng baby would automatically move? Had it moved to the part where she could control him the most? For example, this little finger? The red string on Ning Xuema's hand was also tied to her finger. Coincidentally, it was the same hand that was holding the child's hand. As luck would have it, the two fingers tied to the red string overlapped each other. Chapter 168. Ning Xuema lowered her head and saw it. She was embarrassed. This was like the two fated people tied by Yu Lao's red string. What was she thinking? He was just an ingredient that she caught, and she would eat him later. How could he be the fated person? Even if he was a person, he was so small and not even as tall as a garlic sprout. It was impossible for him to be the fated person. She was thinking too much. To be safe, she grabbed the red string floating around and wrapped it around the little guy in her arms. Although this ginseng baby had high magic power, he was still a baby and didn't have much strength. Therefore, after Ning Xuema got close to him and restrained him, he simply stopped struggling. He just looked at her with a pair of blue eyes, slightly pursed his lips, and his expression was calm. His long hair was floating in the water just now, and a few strands were wrapped around Ning Xuema's wrist and shoulder, making her itch. When Ning Xuema wrapped the red string around him, she also wrapped his long hair. This little baby had high magic power, and he was a ginseng. His hair might be the whiskers of ginseng, and it might be able to wrap around people. It wasn't easy for her to restrain him. She didn't want to fail miserably and be entangled by his long hair. Besides, if it was a 10,000-year-old ginseng, the whiskers of ginseng were also very nourishing. She couldn't lose a single one and waste it. Ning Xuema held him and rolled under the water for a while, then stopped the downward momentum. She paused and wanted to paddle up. She couldn't cook him in the water. If she wanted to eat him, she had to get him ashore and eat him slowly. And why did this baby suddenly become so heavy? She held him as if she was holding a big rock. She couldn't swim up and continued to sink instead. She looked down at the baby in her arms. The baby looked at her expressionlessly, and his red lips were slightly pouted. Was he provoking her? Ning Xuema originally wanted to put the short knife on his neck to threaten him, but now both of her hands were occupied and she couldn't free them. She had an idea and lowered her head, and her red lips were close to the baby's delicate ear. "Little kid, if you play any tricks, I'll bite your ear directly." It was originally inconvenient to speak in the water, but she could still speak with her mouth close to his ear. It was just that her voice was a little strange. After she finished speaking, she even put his earlobe in her mouth and bit it threateningly with her little teeth. The baby's body stiffened for a moment, but its weight suddenly lightened. It was the weight of a normal baby. That's more like it. Ning Xuema was pleased with herself. She finally let go of his ear and swam upwards. The two of them finally emerged from the water. Ning Xuema let out a sigh of relief. Although she had only been underwater for a short period of time, she had done a lot of things. Now she was really tired. The silvery moonlight shone on the child in his arms, making her appear tender and tender. Looking at her up close, the child's facial features were astonishingly beautiful. She was exquisite and perfect like a crystal doll. Ning Xuema couldn't take her eyes off him. "What do you want?" The child finally spoke. His voice was crisp like a string of crystal wind chimes in the wind, and there was a touch of coldness in his voice. "Why don't you guess?" Ning Xuema smiled at him, revealing 4 sparkling white teeth as she replied with an enigmatic tone. The baby's pair of ocean blue eyes blinked. "I can't guess." "Okay, then you don't have to guess. You'll know in a while. Be good and I'll make you feel better." Ning Xuema smiled as if she was comforting him, and she swam towards the shore. Chapter 169. The child's eyelashes were wet. He pursed his lips and did not speak anymore. Ning Shuima stepped on the water. In fact, she was also paying attention to his movements at all times, afraid that he would do something new. The child probably stopped cursing. His little face was gently pressed against her chest, and he was very obedient. The surface of the lake rippled, and the green leaf platform had disappeared without a trace. Under the moonlight, the surface of the lake was like a mirror. If it were not for the child in her arms, Ning Shuima would have thought that everything was a dream. She quickly swam to the shore and carried the child up. She was so tired that her forehead was covered in sweat. She sat on a big rock by the shore and still hugged the child tightly in her arms, not daring to put him on the ground. Ginseng children should know the earth escape technique. If she put him on the ground, he might disappear with a swoosh. How was she going to eat him? Ning Shuima looked at the child and suddenly understood how Tang Sanzang felt when he ate the ginseng fruit back then. The ginseng fruit that Tang Sanzang obtained looked like a child, but it was not alive. At least it was still a fruit. When he ate it, he could just bite it. But the person in her arms had soft skin, big sparkling eyes, and a small red mouth that could talk and move. She was clearly a little child of the human world. She was so beautiful that even the heavens would be jealous of her. She couldn't bring herself to kiss her. No matter where she bit him, she felt that she was committing a sin. She was not a soft-hearted person. She had killed many people in her life, but she had never killed a child, let alone eat one. It seemed that Zhang Guilao was much more ruthless than her. Sob, sob, sob. Perhaps she should close her eyes and throw him into the pot to stew, but there was no pot or firewood here. Strangely enough, although the lake was surrounded by trees, there was not a single leaf or branch to be found, unless she walked further away. She raised her head and looked into the distance. In the distance there were strange-shaped rocks and lush trees. Under the moonlight they looked mysterious and dangerous. This was the 9th peak. Any animal that came out of it would be enough to keep her busy for half a day. It was better not to provoke them for the time being. Gurgle gurgle, a soft sound entered their ears. It was Ning Shuima's intestines. So hungry. Ning Shuima swallowed her saliva. Are you hungry? The child asked again. Not bad. Ning Shuima said with a straight face. Her eyes fell on his silvery hair that was as smooth as the moonlight. Suddenly she had an idea. She raised her hand and pulled out 2 strands of his hair. Then she looked at them hopefully. Why did she pull his hair? Goo? Incantation? The child raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at her. After a while, Ning Shuima's face fell. TV dramas really killed people. She clearly remembered that in a movie, she had seen someone pluck out an old ginseng man's beard, and it turned into ginseng whiskers. However, the hair in her hand was still hair, and it didn't seem to have changed at all. Could that be the ginseng elder and this was a child? Whiskers can change, but baby hair can't. Why can't your hair turn into a ginseng beard? Ning Shuima took out a short knife and placed it horizontally on the child's neck. Hurry up and change a few strands. Otherwise, I'll eat you. The child's lips twitched. He looked down at the short knife on his neck and then looked at her. You want to eat ginseng? That's right. Hurry up and change them. Ning Shuima pressed the short knife down slightly. Her short knife was also given to her by Ji Yunhuang. It was a sharp blade and was a good knife. It shone with a cold light under the moonlight. Chapter 170. This child's skin was as tender as a lotus root. She really wanted to take a bite but did not want to hurt him. Although the knife was pressed against his neck, it was very measured. The child sighed softly. Then let me go, I'll give you the ginseng. She was holding him too tightly, he could not even take his hand away. If I let you go, you'll run away again. Ning Shuima did not let go. You can just come out. The child. He gritted his teeth. Don't worry, I won't run away. If you let go of one of my hands, I can give you 100-year-old ginseng. Ning Shuima was somewhat suspicious. This child was too cunning. Just now he made her suffer a big loss. She had to guard against him. After thinking for a moment, she really let go of one of his hands, the one with the red string. Then hurry up, if you dare to play any tricks, I'll directly cut off your little head. Ning Shuima directly put the knife to his throat, full of threat. The child really did not have any intention of playing any tricks. His little hand gently patted his doo-doo. A thick-looking ginseng emerged. Ning Xuema's eyes lit up. She raised her hand and took the ginseng. The ginseng should really be 100 years old. It had already taken shape. It looked white and plump. There were dozens of whiskers below. Ning Xuema smiled. With this ginseng, she can eat to her heart's content and no longer have to go hungry. It seems that the child in her arms is really a ginseng child. Otherwise, how can a ginseng appear just by patting his doo-doo? She really picked up a treasure. Is his doo-doo 100 treasures pouch? He can produce ginseng with just a pat. Then what about her? Ning Xuema was a person of action. She immediately took action when she thought of something, so she also patted his doo-doo. In the end, she did not manage to pat a shrimp. She did not give up. She simply patted all sides, but did not guard against the fact that she patted a little lower, right between his legs. The child was originally looking at her with a faint smile, but at this moment, his expression changed slightly. He raised his fingertips and a spell was instantly formed. A white light flashed in front of Ning Xuema's eyes. It was so dazzling that she closed her eyes subconsciously. Suddenly there was nothing between her arms. She hurriedly opened her eyes. The baby in her arms had disappeared. Fuck, he still managed to escape. Ning Xuema jumped up and hurriedly looked around. Ginseng baby usually used earth escape to escape, but he could only run underground. But the ground around her was covered with grass, and she could not see a decent hole. She looked at the red string tied to her finger. The red string was fluttering in the wind, and the baby on the other end of the red string had long run away. She searched the surrounding grass again, trying to find a stalk of ginseng, but to no avail. She sighed and sat down on the stone again. So what if he ran away? Even if he was in her hands, she didn't know what to do with him. After all, he couldn't bring himself to bite her, and holding her would be a burden. Fortunately, the ginseng he gave her was still there, enough to appease her hunger. She was also afraid that the ginseng child was up to no good. So she first tested it with a silver needle to confirm that it was not poisonous, and then slowly ate it. She was really hungry. A radish-sized ginseng was finished in a moment, finally satisfying her hunger. The baby did not lie to her. The ginseng he gave her was at least 100 years old. Because she had just climbed out of the water, and this was the peak of a mountain, the weather was cold. Her body was cold, and she almost shivered as she sat there. You're tuning into the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.